we have to settling down.
Good evening and welcome to the September 27th meeting, a joint meeting between the Zoning Board of Appeals and the Planning Board. We'll call the Zoning Board of Appeals meeting to order.
And we will call the planning board meeting to order. At this point, we'll turn it over to our staff and professionals.
Is there a Bob who would like to step up first?
Nominate you.
Okay,
Please introduce yourself.
yes. I'm Bob Mitchell of the two Bobs and Bob Ritchie. And we're very pleased to be back. We were here a month ago to do a broad overview and introduction. And so we greatly appreciate you coming together tonight in a joint meeting so we can talk about things in more specificity and get and help you all help us as we continue drafting in terms of the questions we have for you, and I'm sure you have some questions for us. And of course, we have Brian Curry here, the former town planner, and Frank Duffy, who we've been relying on quite a bit for helping us understand the bylaw, and we appreciate that. So we do have a lot to go through tonight, as I see the nods around the table. So I'd like to start with, I hope everybody has this one, Article 1, Purpose and Authority. So I'd like to start with this for a couple of reasons before we get into the larger ones. So as I think you all know, this project is a recodification plus. So we're recodifying the bylaw in terms of reorganizing it, reformatting it, getting it much, dealing with a lot of language issues and how it's laid out, and a lot of long paragraphs and language, vague language, and bringing it up to date. All those kinds of things you do with a recodification. Plus, and the plus part of it is the town asked us to look into certain sections in more in-depth and in a more substantive manner. And those sections include some of the drafts you have in front of you tonight. The definitions, the use section, and to create some type of use table, which we're going to talk about, the non-conforming section of the bylaw, and you should all have that. And then for the rest of the bylaw, we are not going to be getting into it in any real substantive, complete rewrite type of activity. And quite frankly, many sections of your bylaw don't need any substantive change. They're perfectly fine, they're up to date, they work. So not every section of your bylaw needs substantive review. But as we go through each of those sections, we will be going through every single section. And if we have reorganized them into new articles, and they're now, as we do that, we're going to keep our eyes out for language issues, grammatical errors, out-of-date information, those kinds of things. And the second thing that might happen, and it turns out it did happen with Article 1, is we might come across in a section that poses a question, okay? Some of these will be smooth and easy, you know, just tweaking some language. Some of them might raise a policy issue or might just raise a question. So turns out Article 1 did that. So I wanted to go through Article 1 because we made some simple and easy changes, and then there is a question, and if you read it, you saw what the question is. And then the other document you saw last week, and I assume you have this week, is we've been tracking our proposed deletion, based on conversations with town staff and what we've been finding. And this actually has not changed since what we handed out to you last time. But it gives you an idea of what some of the issues are related to whether something should be or shouldn't be deleted. And there's a whole variety of reasons, it turns out, that there's sections recommended or words recommended for deletion. So with that, Bob, do you want to add anything?
No, that's it.
Okay, thank you. So with Article 1, this is the purpose and authority. This is the standard beginning of every zoning bylaw everywhere. So the first thing, as we footnoted, just to let you know, the purpose, currently your bylaw has everything jammed into a big, long paragraph. And so we pulled it all out and put it, there were 11 separate items, and we just listed 11 separate items to make it easier to see, read, understand, just simple things like that. So we added a B section. We like to beef up the purpose section as much as we can for a variety of reasons, so people who read the purpose section actually understands why you have a zoning bylaw and what its purposes are. Sometimes when you're in court, the judge will actually look at the purpose bylaw and, depending on whatever the case is about, and say, well, why do you have this bylaw? What's the purpose of it? Does it relate to this particular case or not? So it's always good to have, some beefed up language in the bylaw for purpose. So we did that. And as you can see, like in number 10, we brought it up to date to reference. You now have a comprehensive plan rather than a master plan. It's the Cape Cod Commission, not the Cape Cod Planning and Economic Development Commission. So those are examples of the kinds of edits we're making. So then, other than some minor word edits, you get to, on page 2, E, this section, continuance of former bylaw, repealer, which was a unique word to us, but there you go. And quite frankly, when Bob and I went through this multiple times, it's very poorly worded, for one, and it was somewhat, we were kind of scratching our head as to what it was supposed to mean and what it's supposed to do, and luckily Brian talked to us about it, and he gave us his take on it. There's language in here, particularly the last sentence, that's a very big red flag, where it says all bylaws or parts of bylaws heretofore passed, inconsistent herewith, are hereby repealed. Well, there's no definition of what's inconsistent. And it almost implies somebody would be making that decision as to what's inconsistent, and therefore something gets repealed. But of course, the only people that can repeal a section of the bylaw are town meeting, not the planning board or the staff or anything. So that language raises a red flag. And when Bob and I talked about it quite a bit with Brian, we concluded that actually this language is redundant and not necessary. And Bob might want to chime in here because he was the one that really pulled it apart and decided. You want to chime in or not?
Well, the first thing, I didn't understand what it said. Then I had my second cup of coffee and I tried again. But it seems to have been written at an earlier stage in the evolution of the bylaw. It doesn't seem to have applicability in the limited changes that we're making now. Secondly, it seemed to be a little bit redundant because it applied to both provisions of the bylaw that were inconsistent and consistent. So in the absence of any occurrence of its use in the last 30 years, we figured that the best thing would be to do is to get rid of it, or have somebody that understands it better than I do rewrite it to achieve some intent that I can't yet discern in the text.
Any?
I just had a,
30 years.
Yeah, I mean,
Well,
Brian,
I don't ever recall a conversation with Mr. Andrews or Mr. Alcorn or Mr. Gore or Mr. Brandolini, or Mr. Palmer, where we went over this section, or Mr. Duffy. So I don't remember ever using it in 30 years, so perhaps we can get away with another 30 years, but we may want to think about it. It's simple deletion.
The main concern that I could see lurking there is some doubt whether there was any gap in what had been and what is replacing it. Is there some sort of spot at which everything goes away, we have to start over from scratch? Or was there a seamless continuity between the old and the new? I don't think so. And I think on any recodification, one basically repeals the old and adopts the new, with the understanding that provisions that haven't really changed substantively have continuity of existence. They don't go out of existence like Brigadoon and pop back up again later, and the clock starting to run on all of the provisions. So there might have been some apprehension that there was some unknown risk in having that issue not addressed. That's the only thing I can imagine it having been intended to achieve.
Yes, Pat?
I think that, I don't know, because I've only been on the board about 18 years right now, so I think it may refer to, we've been very careful since I've been on the board, when we want to repeal and replace a bylaw, that we do them synchronously in the same town meeting, so that we don't have town meeting vote on a repeal first. We have them vote on the acceptance of a new one and then the repeal, and do it in that order. So I think that may have come about because in way past, that wasn't carefully done. A repeal might have happened, and they didn't vote something else. It's purely a guess, but I know we've been careful about doing it since I've been on the board.
And that's the way to do it, and of course, if town meeting votes, you know, the new section, then everything that in the new section has been adopted, and they vote to repeal the old, then everything in the old has been deleted, and of course, some of it shifts from one to the other in that transaction, but it's nice and clean.
Yeah.
I think Bob wanted to chime in.
Yeah, I just had a question. So if, let's say town meeting did accept a change in the bylaw, and then it goes to the AG's office, and for some reason, they turn it down, does it have to go back to town meeting to repeal it, or could this be why this was in there?
Well, I should let you, because you're former AG, head of municipal services, so.
It's inconceivable that the Attorney General would disapprove a whole recode unless there was some procedural defect that infected the validity of what town meeting did. But if, as you point out, town meeting were presented with the issue of replacing this with that, these things go together. And one doesn't happen without the other. So long as town meeting understands that that's the way it will play out legally, there would be no issue. I have seen instances, however, where deletions were made under one warrant article in anticipation of the adoption of some other town article that failed. And that left the town devoid of some area of regulation. So that concern is not totally frivolous. But I think the way that we contemplate this happening is bundle them together. There's an interdependence about their effectiveness. So one doesn't get adopted, the repeal doesn't get separated from the enactment of the replacement.
So how would you effectively bundle it so that that kind of thing doesn't happen? I mean, I'm saying, okay, we vote in the new and vote out the old, but I see Bob's concern there.
Because you can have situations on town meeting floor where a meeting member amends an article.
Yeah.
In those cases, if the amendments seem to have passed, that's a little harder to figure out in advance. That's where I was wondering what the.
Yeah, one of the issues to keep in mind is that when the recode is presented to the town meeting, presented to the Attorney General, the whole bylaw is under scrutiny. If this were done incrementally, taking each section and making incremental changes here, there, and everywhere, these things could be addressed from a legal point of view by the AG only with respect to those matters that have changed. But if it's a complete recode, there conceivably could be something in the current bylaw that the Attorney General has no authority to look at. But with a recode, the whole document is up for review. So, I mean, it needs to be kept in mind that there may be provisions of the bylaw that the Attorney General is saying, boy, I wouldn't approve that today. And yet, here would be an opportunity to do that. I mean, you have to be aware that the whole text is now on the Attorney General's workbench for action.
And if the Attorney General did send something back to the town not approving it, whether it was an amendment or whether it was a part of, a piece of an amendment that the town's taken, that the town is proposing, or a part of a new bylaw, whatever that the Attorney General sends back, then they will explain to you why they said no, and then it's up to the town to decide, well, we can rewrite this to meet the objections of the Attorney General and go back to town meeting, or, you know, perhaps just forget about it, I guess, that's another option.
Brian?
So all we're really simply saying is that if you're looking for a fail-safe provision, this should be rewritten, because what we have today is not understandable. Well, we understand the fail-safe concept, if in fact, you know, you're not doing it sequentially correct, or someone makes an amendment on town meeting floor, changes the setback requirements, and now docks and floats have to be 10 feet from the water. That's a true story here in town. Yeah, we see that, we understand that, the purpose of it, but we think for at least its deletion, then if you want another fail-safe provision, we can come up with something.
I think we need that.
Are we safe in just deleting it? Or Brian, are you saying
I'm unconcerned, but, in its deletion, because we haven't really referenced it.
because if we haven't used it in 30 years, I'm pretty comfortable with just making this go away and moving on.
Right, and what I'm saying is if you want to have something a little other, more fail-safe, I can take a look at it.
We haven't had a problem in 30 years. I don't see a need to protect against it.
Then you share my unconcern, that's good.
Okay?
You take a sense of the people here, or?
Anyone want to preserve this on our side?
No.
Planning board doesn't have an interest in it.
I'm just looking for, well, however you want to do it. If you want to vote it, just give us a thumbs up, thumbs down consensus on this, or
I
consensus.
think thumbs up
Whatever
will
we
go
can take
fast.
back and, you know, add, delete, rewrite, cross. Oh, thank you. So, okay, so that's an example of one of the sections that will be more easily written by us and reviewed by you, because there won't be a lot of big changes to it.
Can I just ask a question?
Question? Yes, Pam.
Under the purpose, I mean, I've reread this and reread this over and over and over again, and number 2, under the purpose, to conserve health. I know you can conserve energy, and I know you can conserve other things, but is that similar to the protection of human health?
I don't know. That's your existing language. Everything 1 through 11 is all the existing language. So this is the time to look at this as well, to say, wait a minute, maybe we should update as well. Usually that is written to protect the public health. That's how it's normally written.
Right.
In bylaws. Here, somehow it got written to conserve health. It is a little oddly
I mean,
worded.
Usually it's coupled like to protect human health and the environment. That's
Something like
usually the couple that, you know, go together. Because to me, to conserve health is meaningless. I mean, hopefully people are healthy and they want to maintain their health, but to conserve health, I think is weird. And, I mean, honestly, I try not to wordsmith, but it's very hard.
No, I mean, I appreciate that. I mean, some things that are in your bylaw, as Bob said, you know, maybe the Attorney General won't understand everything that's in your bylaw, and we didn't understand, and this is your opportunity to take a new look at everything that's in your bylaw, because you're gonna be reviewing everything, and spot things like this and say, maybe we should just tweak it right now.
I like your point. The issue is that the town simply have all this authority. Stating it really is drawing out the implications of the Home Rule Amendment, which gives you the right to do almost anything relating to health, safety, and welfare. I mean, it's broad. The purposes of zoning are well established, whether you articulate them or not. And by putting them in this form here, this is not an exclusive list. This is just illustrative of the kinds of things you could do.
Right.
And sometimes it's helpful to put a list of things to just trigger the imagination of the reader about what you can do with zoning. So there's some value in putting some illustrations of what zoning can do for you. As for the word conserve, I think I'd prefer almost any other word than that, but to protect, to secure, to assure, but to conserve is a strange verb, but this is a.
Sounds like
Bob
you're
said,
spending your
this is
health.
a chance to strike it if you don't like it.
Yes, Paul.
Bobby, I think you mentioned that the Attorney General's office may not look at a particular section. Do they look at this selectively? I thought they look at the entire package.
Yeah, in its entirety, in its parts. So if you had a bylaw in there that forbade lawyers from having lunch in town on Friday, that would be stricken. So they'd strike portions of it. The Attorney General has the authority to approve or disapprove or to approve in part. The authority to disapprove a bylaw partially depends on whether the Attorney General feels that they've stricken such an essential part that the balance makes no sense. And so they look critically at all of the words of each section to make certain that the disapprovals are surgically narrow.
Pat, you have,
Thank you.
If I,
Go ahead.
well, I just wanted to go back to the previous conversation in hopes of bringing some closure to it, unless other people have comments or thoughts or suggestions on conserving health.
Oh, I just wanted to jump in on that. I agree. I think the change should protect human health, the public health is beneficial. But I will just say, I mean, this is certainly, zoning is not limited to these purposes, but I think that this was referenced earlier. Courts do look at this. And I think the case that comes to mind is Kenner, where the Chatham zoning bylaw says to preserve views. And so in that case in Kenner, abutters had standing to object to a change in a view or a blockage of their view. So I do think it's important that we look at these and make sure that these adequately reflect the interests in the town, because the courts will look at them and say, well, what's the town, really, what's the purpose in the bylaw? And so I think it's important that we review these. So I just wanted to make that point.
That's a very, very good point, because the courts often say that the town could have done something had they had that provision in the bylaw. But since they didn't, we're not going to add it by inference. I'll say this, that a statement of purpose standing alone doesn't do it unless there are provisions in the bylaw that implement that purpose. But the point is well taken, that the bylaw needs to be checked to make certain that it has working provisions that achieve the purposes that at least you start out saying you want to achieve.
you done, Pat? Pam?
Yeah, I'm just gonna, so much of this seems so antiquated, the language. I mean, I'm not sure how the town provides adequate light and air. I've never known a town that was liable for air. Clean air,
A lot of this language literally comes from the Standard State Zoning Enabling Act from 1926, where light and air was big in New York City for tenements. So that's sort of the history behind that. So yeah, it's language that's antiquated. If you feel as though we need to incorporate more of the issues that surround the vision of the town, because remember, zoning bylaws implement your land use maps, which implements your local comprehensive plan, which implements your vision. Otherwise, it's mindless bureaucracy. That's why we're here. So sure, you know, it's old, archaic language. Could it be tweaked to be consistent with the town's vision? That's where you come in, folks.
We have a bylaw that you will not overshadow.
Right,
Light
Yeah,
and
I
air.
believe,
Light and
I
air.
understand the light part.
You know, you're talking, you know, solar access, but light and air literally comes from some of the tenement issues in New York City.
There are some virtues in continuity with what has
True.
been on the books. It may be archaic, but it's something that has been there for a while. If it does no harm. When Bob and I approached this, our goal was to preserve as much as we can of what the bylaw does and how it feels, making only those changes that serve two purposes. One is we have to fix some of the legal issues that may lurk there, and next, organize it so that like stuff is together. So if we achieve those two purposes, we'll take whole cloth, everything that was there before, and just bring it over. Unless there was some reason to strike it from either an organizational or a legal point of view.
Pat, you had a suggestion on language, and I think it's already been mentioned
Well,
before.
My thought was, we need to get a sense, because I think protect the public health needs to be put in instead of conserve health. So we need to get a sense whether we all agree to that. I
Makes
see
more sense.
nods.
I mean,
And that's
Okay.
consistent with 48, it says protect health, safety, and welfare. So we're using the same language to Bob's point.
So, that shall
Could
be
we
changed.
could we couple that with, the phrase that normally goes together, protect human health and the environment? Because the environment plays a pretty significant role in human health.
Sure, I mean, you, yes, you can, but however you want to write this, as long as it A, makes sense, and B, accomplishes your goal, then just let us know if we can, decide that. You could have two of them. You could have a protect the public health, safety, and welfare, and you could have protect human health and environment and whatever. Those are your choices.
I believe the environment is covered under 9.
Way covered under here, Pam.
I think it's already set. Charlotte, you had a comment?
I did, but it's on a different subject, is that
It's
all right?
okay.
I'd like to talk about B. Was very glad to see that added. It's been my understanding that one of the major purposes of the zoning, of the planning board, the ZBA, is to preserve and enhance the character of the town. So I assume that's why you've added this.
Yes.
It was really among the missing and needed to be there. As long as we are doing it, and it's good that we're doing it, would it be useful to identify what we think the character of the town is? Character can be anything. What character are we preserving and protecting? I looked at the local comprehensive plan, hoping we could just lift language from it, that it would be there, but it's not. So it's sort of open.
Subjective.
Yeah,
Um,
go ahead, I have an answer for you.
Oh, good. I was thinking traditional, historic, something like that, but I'm not sure that's what everybody agrees on, but would it be useful to identify it?
Pat, you remember the discussion we had about character, and it was in culture and all that, it was whose, and at what time frame do you choose? Character is sort of something that evolves over time, and Falmouth is evolving. The beachfront is gonna be totally different now than it was in the 50s. So to really put a concrete definition on it, we found to be very difficult to do.
I think it would be impossible. So how concrete is historic? History, after all, doesn't end in 1600. And I think it's continuing even now. So that would be pretty broad.
Pat, you all set?
No, I mean, the only thing I can add to that is that when we were doing the local comprehensive plan, we were discussing enhancing and keeping the character of the various villages, because we
Which
have
were
so
all
many
different.
villages that each have their own character.
Right.
So I think we gotta leave it just as is.
One difficulty is legislation speaks as of the date it was enacted, and as the point you make, it is an evolving process. Character of the neighborhood is something courts look to at the time the case arises. A fresh look at the neighborhood may be quite different than the fresh look given 10 years earlier when it was enacted. So because it is a moving target and an evolving concept, the idea of consistency with the neighborhood, for example, requires a determination of character that is not time anchored. And I don't think there's any harm in leaving that in there, because it preserves the right to look at it at the relevant time when issues arise.
So you would say it's better to leave it open?
Because if you look at,
That's the conclusion we came when we dealt with this in the local comprehensive plan. We couldn't,
Remember, this is a broad statement.
yeah,
You know, you'll get into the weeds and get into the specifics when you get into some of your permit criteria. You'll see those specific, to the neighborhood type issues.
Right.
But this is your broad statement of purpose.
Yeah.
Character is multifaceted. We have shoreline, we have different villages. So I would leave it broad, general, in this area.
It's also quite subjective.
In this instance, it's a broad-based, the character of the town, but the character of the town is many, many things. We get into that as we get more specific into certain zoning districts, and then you get into uses.
I agree.
Some uses are allowed by permits, and those permits then have specific requirements about character of the neighborhood. What might be good in Wacoit may not be so good in Hatchville, things of that nature. So you sort of drill down from here, but I wouldn't drill down in this section.
It's good to also know that really section 1.1 doesn't do anything. It says what all of the other sections will do. And so this is a statement of what you hope to achieve and everything that follows. So it's in whatever follows that you actually legislate in ways that get what you want, not here. This doesn't do it. This says what you're going to get.
Ready to move on?
Well said.
Keep going.
Could we get back to conserving health? Because we had two different language proposals, or maybe three, and I'd really like to see if we could conclude something tonight in terms of either protecting public health, safety, and welfare, which is the classic statement, or protecting, I forgot, Pat, what you,
Human health
you
and
put
the
it-
environment.
the human health and environment. So is it one or the other, or both, or some combination, or what would people be comfortable with?
I think protecting health is good. I honestly feel that 9 covers the environment. We
I
we
would
could say
be,
it twice, but
I would be more inclined to do what you said, which is consistent with 40A. I mean, what was it, public health?
Public
sa-
health.
or
Public health, safety, and welfare.
Protect the health. So
I mean, that's
to protect
consistent with
health.
the Enabling Act.
That's
Or the statute.
really the foundation of zoning,
Yeah.
that phrase right there, but you can add things to it, I mean, or add other pieces.
And we don't add any words to the bylaw by just protecting, removing, conserving. Just a minor shorting of the bylaw.
Thank you.
Protect public health.
Protect public health, safety, and welfare.
Protecting the
Public
public
health,
health, safety.
Safety.
Safety and welfare.
Public health, safety, and welfare.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, is there anything else on Article 1? Any other questions or comments? And if not, we can put that one, skip ahead to the rest of the process. Okay. So in sequential order, the next one is
Excuse me,
Article.
I'm
Oh,
sorry.
I'm
I
sorry.
do have a question. So I'm just seeing that amendment process, no amendment to this chapter shall be made except by a 2/3 vote. I think at the state level, there might be legislation at least to change that. I mean, should we be that specific, or should we make it consistent with
What language was that?
the 2/3 vote at town
To
meeting?
change zoning and
Town-
whether
opt-in for-
efforts to change that at the state level.
I don't know how, I mean, how successful they'll be, but is it better to be so specific, or is it better to tie something like that to the state statute?
You know, it's like a discussion between the far left and the far right.
Yeah.
There are people that love the idea of 2/3 vote, and others that think it ought to be a simple majority.
Yeah,
And the idea is, if it's a simple majority, a town may be better able to achieve some of its planning objectives without having to achieve a higher quantum of vote. On the other hand, having a higher quantum of vote may prevent the town from adopting things that are not so desirable.
right. So I guess
So-
I'm not contesting the validity of which is better. I'm just asking, does it make sense to be so specific in our provision, or does it make sense to tie it to whatever is
Well,
permissible on the?
So, I have two comments.
Yes.
One is if we tied it to something specific, we'd tie it to the existing section of
Right,
48.
which will be changed
Which will be
anyways.
changed. So that will be,
Mm-hmm.
and the second, quite frankly, I started being involved on changing the zoning act 25 years ago,
And it hasn't, yeah.
and it hasn't changed. And Bob has been working with unbelievable amounts of hours for I don't know how many years.
17 years, yeah.
17 years. So there's a
MMA has
trend
fought-
there.
Right, right.
MMA has fought the 2/3 consistently. So it's not going anywhere this session and probably next as well.
Okay.
Brian, you had something? We all-
And the way the zoning reform's been written in the past, it was an opt-in.
Okay.
We'd have to change this.
Thank
Or it
you.
was an opt-out. I mean,
Or an opt-out.
there are so many iterations,
I think I like the last version.
yeah.
Okay, so Article 3, definitions.
Pat?
Okay,
Could I just introduce it for 1 second?
sure. You hesitated. I jumped in.
Oh, I'm sorry. I won't do that again.
Stop inhaling.
Yeah, I'll try not to breathe anymore. Just very simple. Most of the definitions here are in your bylaw. So we took the ones that are in your definition sections, and then, like a lot of different topics in your bylaw, there's definitions spread all over the place. So we're trying to aggregate them, and as you can see, not only aggregate them into the definition section, but like terms being aggregated, so you don't have to, even within the definition section, look all over the place, because restaurants are under R, but fast food restaurants under F, and those kinds of problems that pop up. And then alphabetize things, which is, you know, a pretty simple way of making the bylaw easier to use, so we're doing that. And then we've added a few, and where we have added, we've said new, and then the only other thing I'll say is, for some terms where people might go, and like if you see on page 7, there's a, comprehensive plan, we say see master plan, because that's where it is in the definition. So there's a navigation guide within the definition
We
section.
don't have a master plan. I mean, we have a local comprehensive.
Right, so, but you have a definition of master plan in the bylaw. So if you want to we can swap that around, we can put master plan, see the definition for comprehensive plan. But again, this is not, your opportunity to actually see in alphabetical order what's in your bylaw. And if you have, red flags or questions or, tonight and going forward, because this is a big section, these are opportunities.
Okay, do you want some little changes?
I want
As well as
anything.
big change? Okay.
Anything.
Little change under agricultural and farm-related terms, where you've got bees and fur-bearing animals, right at the last of the bullets there. They need-
Okay,
They need verbs. The keeping of bees, the keeping of fur-bearing animals, because all the others have the growing. keeping of.
good catch, yeah.
Okay.
Okay,
Farm-related business, related to, in that first sentence. A business operated on a farm parcel, related to.
I'm sorry, where are you?
Who is missing? Farm-related business, go down further.
Oh, the business operated on a farm parcel related to, okay, yep.
I do believe that nursery, because of an experience that we had, needs to be expanded in some way. Does one tree constitute a nursery? If you've got one tree for sale?
Well, agriculture has to be a primary use, so one tree would never be a primary use of it.
Well, there was an
We
argument.
lost the case based on
Yep.
that.
What constitutes a nursery?
There are so many, well, what I can do is probably go over
Would
the
you?
case with Bob and
Yes.
Bob, and so they can become familiar with it.
Yes.
Get the nuances. It's just a land court case.
So I
Is it a
think,
Falmouth case or
Yes.
some other?
Yeah,
Found.
Yeah.
I think we need
Oh.
to have a little bit further definition as to what a nursery is.
Well, let me just, before we leave with that, it has to be commercial agriculture before it enjoys any protection under the statute. So,
This is a lapsing of a special permit, and it was determined that because they had one tree, it
For
was,
sale.
it is still,
Let's, we're looking into the weeds yet.
You guys deal with that
Let them
issue.
read the
Okay.
case so they can become familiar with it. We'll come back to that.
It might, like you said, it may just be an expanded, more defined definition.
Yeah, somehow.
Used to be
Okay.
a nursery.
If you go over to automobile, the very last one, vehicular stacking area. There may be queuing, we've got a car wash coming in, and one of the objections was that, there could be a large amount of queuing in the
Right.
summer, and this is limited to a drive-through
Right.
window.
Okay,
So that should probably be expanded. B, the next page, to the highest point of is duplicated, cross one of them out. That's
With-
that third line down.
I'm sorry,
Okay, it's page 5,
okay,
third line down, remove the duplicate to the highest point of. And then I'm wondering,
oh, yeah, okay.
because you said commas are very important. on the second line, the one right above it,
Uh-huh.
across the actual building line, I think there should be a comma there. I don't know. I've got that.
Yeah, I agree with it.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, am I picky?
No, these are great.
Okay.
Towns have lost court cases because of
Oh.
commas.
Let's go back to the prior page then. Recreational trailer or vehicle, the third line down, comma after two. I think there should be a comma there,
Comma after,
but it's not limited to.
but is not limited to, oh, yes, right.
Okay.
Okay, great, thank you.
Betting 1,000.
Woo-hoo! Okay, go to page 6. Structure, second line.
Page 6, structure, yes.
I think there should be a hyphen after before, so it becomes before damaged. Some people would argue you don't have to, that that's too closed.
Where were you referring to? Structure?
Structure dash substantial damage. The second line
Oh, second
down.
one, yeah.
So it becomes a single modifying word by adding the hyphen, before damaged.
Structural damage,
Oh, structural damage, the second line,
substantial damage.
with the hyphen?
We just, if you would.
Pardon, okay. You started the first there, the cost of restoring the structure to its before damaged.
Oh, okay.
condition.
Oh, okay.
Very bottom there, under business and commercial related terms. While in the motor vehicle, remove one N. INN is an inn that you sleep in. Maybe you're sleeping in the car.
Oh,
no.
Okay.
Okay, next page. Common ownership. Ownership by one or more.
Yep.
That's getting to the core of the problem.
Pardon? Let's see.
It's okay.
Oh, family childcare home. Fourth line down. The childcare, remove the S, homes. You don't want it homes, you want it singular.
Right.
Next page, page 8. Environmental related items under alteration of the land form. The very last one. It shouldn't be issues, it should be issued, and then a period instead of a comma.
The building permit
Yeah,
has
can we go
been
back to the
issued.
family childcare homes?
Sure.
So that should, you want that to read family childcare home?
Home,
Shall not?
the childcare home.
Shouldn't it have a family
receives.
childcare home?
Yes. Okay, it could be a well,
A family childcare home shall.
so add family in there too, even though it's under family childcare home already.
I'm just saying, it sounds funny, saying family childcare home shall not.
No, the childcare home receives for temporary custody and care for a limited.
Oh, okay, I'm looking at another sentence.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I thought you were changing the one
No.
way down, okay.
No, no, no.
Okay,
No.
move on.
Okay, so we go back to page 8. Flood insurance maps, second line on that, you've got 7, 9, comma. Remove one of the commas.
Wow, you are terrific.
I just do proofreading, it's terrible. Okay, I can't read my writing. Oh, we have a newer map, so that's gonna have to be substituted, no? Thought we had a newer FEMA map.
Oh,
that we're
you do, but it has never been voted at town meeting.
Thought it was. Oops. Okay,
We'll talk about that a little more,
okay.
about conservation versus zoning.
Okay, the next page, marsh. The second line down, or a stream, comma.
Got it?
Okay, go to the next page. Contractor's yard. The last word on the first line, instead of for, I think it should be or construction contractor or subcontractor,
Yes.
okay?
Can we go back to environmental,
The which one?
environmental related terms? In looking at dune, in this era of trying to stem sea level rise, should we include something as to man-made dunes?
Oh, instead of just say naturally occurring?
I mean, we could have a dune that's man-made,
We have
with a
a lot
parking
of them.
garage under it, like they do in Holland,
Yeah.
yeah.
So you'd say suggest that to a
I'm just asking,
natural-
I'm just asking the question, should we enhance the definition of dune to
Yeah,
include
I
man-made?
think we should.
We'll take a peek at that for you.
You'll take care of that.
Give that some thought. 'cause
Okay.
Because if you cruise our shoreline, both Minot Beach and Surf Drive, in my lifetime, all the dunes are there, we made. They have been enhanced, but they were built, you know.
Yeah, so maybe it just means not, not take out naturally, it could be,
It could be enhanced, you know, there's all sorts of things you can do. So before we start wordsmithing it, we'll
Right.
take
Look at it, okay.
Give it some,
there are artificial dunes, there are enhanced dunes. Dunes move.
well, I think
Yeah.
Bob was referring to, it starts off as naturally occurring.
We'll start with the natural
necessarily.
ones and
Add in.
add in.
Add in.
Okay,
All right,
add to
thanks.
instead of take away, good idea.
Thanks.
So, let's go to page 11, kennel-related terms, under kennel, third line. What is a personnel kennel? Are you holding people in a kennel? Or should that be personal kennel? Sorry,
Where is that?
it's the third line,
Page
under
11?
kennel.
Three.
Zoning fine.
Personnel kennel.
Could that be town hall?
I'm not going there. You're funny, Pat.
Okay,
Find you another hobby.
under kennel, commercial, fourth line down, next to the last word, it should be pet shop instead of per shop,
Per shop, pet shop.
okay?
You know how many people have read these definitions over and over
Oh,
and
yeah.
over and over again, and you just never catch it.
That's why you need 3 people reading it.
That's why we need new eyes, and that's,
Or we should have asked Pat to proofread it
yeah.
15
Yeah.
years ago.
Yeah.
contracted with Chad.
Can I ask a question? Are you finished, Pat? Or-
Oh, no.
No,
Okay.
No. Let's see. Maybe that's as far as I got on the definitions, but I do think that we should add municipal use to the definitions, because we're putting municipal use in all of the zoning areas, and we don't have a definition of it, and it says that it will be whatever unless it's excluded. And so we need to limit it somewhere to what we really are accepting of, so that we have an easy source of reference to it. Because when you're adding it throughout, I think we need to know what we're dealing with.
Right, and that's a good point, which relates to the use table, as you just referenced. So when we get to the use table, you have a few municipal uses that in your existing bylaw require a special permit or are not allowed in certain zones, but only a few. And so that would be one area to think about, to also address what you want where and what you don't want where in terms of municipal uses, is to put specific ones in the use table and say, this is allowed in this zone, but not that zone, or, so when we get there, I think that will tie in with having a definition.
I know within the bylaw, at some place, it does define what we consider currently to be municipal use, but that doesn't mean that it won't be expanded. So we need some reference point.
The definition ought not to be so narrow that it can't evolve.
Right. But we need to know, has it evolved, so that we can add another definition in? It leaves me uneasy when we don't have a reference point. And I will continue proofing, that's as far as, yeah, page 11, that's as
Could you
far as.
share that with us going forward? I mean, it would be great to have your
course.
annotated notes.
Of course.
I have a couple on
I think we have
page
some general
19.
comments about
Go
that.
ahead.
On page 19, under fifth item down, flicker, should say rotation of the blades.
Which one is that?
Is that under flicker?
The flicker?
Yeah,
On the rotation
of the blades.
of the blades, yes. Okay, good, thanks.
And the next, under net metering, the bottom line should say into the electric distribution system. Just add the word system.
Okay, great.
I have more of a, I guess, a general overview comment, and certainly this is just my opinion. But I had written down when we were here last time, I said, okay, I'm gonna try and look for a term, right? And I guess I should back up. The whole point of this, I think what we heard a lot last time was purpose is ease of use. Let's make this easier to use. That way a homeowner could pick it up and look at it. And so I was just sitting here and I said, okay, let me look up there was something in the table, I think it was the use table, that said affordable. I said, well, what does affordable mean? Does that mean it's on the standardized housing inventory? So then I went to the definitions and I went from A and I said, oh, affordable's not there. And I said, well, where else would affordable be? And I know enough to know, okay, it's probably under housing. So then I went there. But the point being is, in my opinion, there's nothing simpler than alphabetical order. And so I think it should just all be in alphabetical order. I think I understand what you're trying to do in terms of grouping, but I don't necessarily think that it aids anything, in my opinion. I mean, I think somebody coming in is going to say, okay, well, what's this term? Let me go look at it in the definition. There's nothing simpler than alphabetical order if we're looking for a term. So in my opinion, I think that would add clarity just to have it A to Z.
Could I follow that up
Sure.
with an approach to solve the problem that still leaves the document clustered for meaning that has relationship to each other? And that would be, in addition to a regular table of contents, which would be linear in the same shape, it would be an indexed table of contents. In other words, you'd have a table of contents that basically mirrors the structure that we have here. But you take the key words, the salient words of each section, and you make those a list, and those are alphabetized, and they are hyperlinked to the relevant section. It's an easy thing to do. I'm doing it in another town right now. And so you'd have the table of contents, and then you'd have all of the meaningful terms that one would look for that are somewhere in there, and you array those in alphabetical form, side by side to the table of contents. So if you're looking for it, you just hit A on the index table of contents, and it jumps you to the right section.
Right, but I guess it's just, I mean, we're doing all of these different things to make it simpler and to jump, but there's nothing simpler than going A to Z. And then my other concern is that if there's a term, and I don't have one readily available, but say there's a term under wind energy systems, right? And it's not otherwise defined, but it's used in the bylaw somewhere else. So as an attorney, I'm looking at that and saying, well, that's related only to wind-related energy. That's not applicable in this circumstance. I mean, I think it's just creating an opportunity for argument and for ambiguity where you could just go A through Z and it would be very simple. I mean, again, it's just my opinion.
So could you, in the format you have here, let's take dwelling, for instance. Dwelling is under residential-related terms, but it's also alphabetical, saying C, residential-related terms. So couldn't you do all of the definitions in alphabetical order, and then when it is one that's also in a grouping, just refer people to go to that grouping?
And then we're getting
Well, but you're,
definitions that are half the bylaw, right? I mean,
well, in the setup you have right now, like, you're only pulling out certain ones. Dwelling
Right, we
seems to
could
be,
certainly do, more cross-referencing.
because I have the same issue, I think, that Kim did. If you're making this simple for people to use, and a layman just grabs a book, they're going to look for terms by alphabetical. And if they can't find something, then they're gonna have to go page to page and see, what they're looking for and what it fits into.
I mean, I agree in part. But if you, for example, if you look at the wind energy-related systems terms, they actually go from A to S. So if somebody wanted to know definitions on that topic, and they just went to W, they're gonna miss most of the definition.
But if I wanted to go, let's say floodproofing, I can't look at alphabetical under F, I have to know that floodproofing is listed under environmental-related terms.
Right, so we could, but under F, we could put floodproofing, C.
Yeah, so if there's some kind of directional that lets
Right,
them
like-
know, they can find it alphabetically under the term, and then they can be referred to what section it.
Right, so, I mean, it's a balance here between, one way or the other, because they both have pros and cons.
Charlotte?
I think as soon as you get into a categorization system, as you've proposed here, you wind up having to have an index to the categories that you're using.
Yeah.
Otherwise, people can't find things because they don't necessarily categorize in the same way you have, because there are different systems of logic. So you'd have to begin the definition section with a listing of the categories that you've included, and you'd have to conclude the definition section with an all-encompassing index for every term in it, so that Kim's point would also be addressed, that you could find it no matter what. Even if you don't follow the categorization, you can find flicker under F. It would be there, so that,
And it
I
would
think
direct you
that comes
to-
up under any categorization system.
Pam?
So on that same theme, when I look at business and commercial-related terms, and we have drive-through establishment, drive-through window, woodwork mill, which would seem to me to couple with contractor's yard and salvage yards much more, it makes more sense to me than a drive-through window, because, well, let me backtrack to my concern. And I've lived through this before, so a woodwork mill, a salvage yard, and a contractor yard could conceivably be used in the very same way. And we went through this discussion with a contractor yard on a site plan where concerns were that they were doing a lot of mill work. And it's very hard to control if you have somebody who has, quote, a contractor's yard, and they can fabrication of sub-assemblies, which could mean they could do smaller boards for construction, for example, which is a whole different ballgame for residential neighbors who have to listen to and deal with things that are similar to a woodworking mill. There's nothing here that prohibits somebody in a contractor yard from fabricating some wood. And environmentally, once you start cutting that wood or you start stripping the bark, then you have an environmental issue that isn't contained in this bylaw. And actually, there's nothing really stopping anybody who has a salvage yard where they can disassemble, wreck, structural wrecking and structural steel and equipment. There just needs to be, for me, to be some separation of what people can actually do in those three areas. But I just don't think that the salvage or the woodwork mill belongs with the drive-through windows. It's a woodwork mill where somebody can bring trees in, strip the bark, start slicing the lumber for houses or whatever it is. If it abuts a residential area, is pretty detrimental to that residential area. but I don't think it goes, I understand the business-commercial related terms, but it doesn't seem, it seems like it needs to be paired a little bit better with a contractor's yard and a salvage yard.
Pam, I agree with you. That jumped out at me, but I thought, ugh, what do you do with it? When I was
Well,
reading
now's
it.
the time for us to make
Yeah.
some,
Now's the
needs
time
to
to
be
do, you
some
know, but, yeah,
alteration.
so,
Mhm.
I mean, some of these, you know, there's a little bit of square pegs and round holes because of the existing definitions and because of the existing use structure you have with your bylaw. So, you know, we knew, putting this together, that we really wanted to get your feedback because you would know better as to what the histories are, like you just said.
Well, I would just like some protection for abutters. If there's going to be any of that slicing of wood, the noise is unbearable when trucks come in, big tongs come up, pick up a load, drop it in a truck, and then the slicing with the particulates going all over the place, which are pretty carcinogenic. So I just want to make sure that any residence that butts up against one of these other zones is protected. And if we have something in here that talks about enclosing that work that needs to be done, I'd be okay with that. And we had the issue with the contractor's yard, because if they are also housing fertilizer, I don't want that fertilizer to be on the ground. I want it to be on a concrete pallet of some sort that's contained so that it doesn't run off into the groundwater.
And we
So it
just-
may be that, this kind of comment, and for any of the uses, is addressed, maybe in multiple places, but perhaps the best place is in the use table, where you have your standards and conditions listed for each use. So where, for example, woodwork mill is listed in the use table, you could have, I don't know if there are already standards and conditions for that, but you could list standards and conditions such as enclosing, enclosing the operation, or, the operation has to have such a setback from any residential property, or whatever you want to do, because that's where your conditions are tied into the use and where it is and isn't allowed.
I was just thinking, though, in the definitions, if people are aware of what they can and can't do, just under the definition, so that in a salvage yard, you couldn't, you could store things, people could come in and buy them, like most salvage yards have. It just seems a little bit open-ended to me, and that maybe the contractor, the salvage, and as I said, the woodwork mill should all be sort of grouped together, since they have the potential of very similar actions
So
that
you're
would
talking
attach
about
to it.
taking woodwork mill out of business and commercial-related items and putting it in industrial-related items?
Well, I don't know, it is a commercial-related
Yeah.
woodworking, I guess, but not necessarily. What?
Logging, yeah, the issue with logs.
Paul, you should make a comment to everybody.
We're talking about logging.
What, because I couldn't hear what you were
Follow-up to her
saying.
question, she was still providing a question.
Right, so that,
Well, what was the question? We couldn't hear it.
no, that those three distinct things, I think, need to be looked at more, as in one
Okay.
grouping.
Yeah.
Right,
So you would prefer to see those higher intensity uses
Speak up.
placed in, say, the industrial-related terms rather than business terms?
Yeah.
Like I said before, this is your definitions. And then when you get to your use table, you can say where they can and cannot go. And then in that use table, when you have, in this district, they're allowed, or they're allowed by right or by special permit, then you get into the conditions. You must be X number of feet from whatever it might be. So that's how it sort of works. But we get your point that a woodworking mill, because of some of the nuisance qualities that it would have,
right.
is really more of a industrial-related term, and that's where we're gonna put it.
So we'll look at rewriting these and then where they should best be located.
And I think when we look at the woodworking,
Okay.
the contractor should be the same.
We're losing We have people on the other side who
No,
like
I
to be
just
heard.
wanted to make, so obviously, I'm anti the grouping, that's been made clear, but I think this point gets to it. So we're saying, okay, a woodworking mill, that's commercial, but it's really akin to industrial, and it's just like adding these extra layers that don't necessarily need to be there, and it's just adding confusion. I mean, whether it's allowed in an industrial district, a commercial district, that's in the use table, that's going to be there. So it's like adding these layers that I think just adds unnecessary confusion. I think this point that you made, well, woodworking mill, oh, that seems more like this industrial use that's allowed here. I think it just amplifies the point that I'm trying to make anyways, which is, why are we categorizing these so tightly where it might be detrimental? I understand everybody else may feel differently, but yeah.
No, I see the point, but, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, you finish it.
So it
then
might
Charles-
be that we'll have a discussion amongst ourselves that the upfront definitions would be alphabetical.
Right.
Yes.
And that those folks who want to really get down deeper into the weeds, we can have a category.
Yeah.
Section. So that addresses Kim's point.
Charlotte, you were patiently raising your hand.
Thank you. But Brian already
For a
actually addressed it. I think the grouping is very useful for anyone using it. Very useful. I'd hate to lose that. But I think the system of having them first alphabetical for all the terms and then showing the categories so that you see what potentially you should also be thinking about if you are thinking in this category is helpful for people. And it would be a better presentation that way. Otherwise, you wind up with the double indexing.
So it's more of a packaging issue.
It is. Yeah.
Keep moving.
We'll come back with a revised, something that tries to balance all of this out.
Next, keep going.
Well, we just, this is open comment for a little while, because we definitely want to get to the use tables, to at least start getting through that, so.
I have a couple other definition issues as well. Sari had forwarded some comments from one of the ZBA members who couldn't be here. So I've got that email. I'd just like to pass through the points that Dave pointed out. We were talking about those as well while we're on that definition. This was emailed to Bob and Bob, I think, September 21st. You guys may have this already, but I can agree. So, a definition of site triangle should be eliminated, since state highway requirements should have performance standards for horizontal and vertical curves. This is on page 12, the definition. Did I get it? That's,
Yeah,
page
12.
So site triangle. So this, and I'm not sure who, I can sort of guess based on who's here and who's not. But the definition of site triangle should be eliminated. How does the body feel about that?
If I could just,
Yes, Bob.
so these are two different things. The state highway standards are for curb, the curb radius and whatnot within the state highway right-of-way. The site triangle is on private property, when people, plant small bushes that turn into big bushes, and then if it's at an intersection, and you've got to kind of edge your car out to look around the bushes to see if cars are coming one way or another, or something else, a fence gets put up or something like that. That's what the site triangle is, a safety measure to give the town the ability to enforce those problems where something shows up on the private property at an intersection. So it's to me, these are two very different things.
We live on a site triangle. It is dangerous. I wouldn't eliminate it.
Yeah, I wouldn't eliminate it either.
Okay.
All right, if I may go on.
Yes.
Second, the definition of wind turbine should be eliminated or refined to the following, and this is page 20. A wind turbine is a device that converts the wind's kinetic energy into electrical energy.
Well, it can also pump water.
Right?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, it's not just electric energy.
I think that's like a substantive change that I am not an engineer and not qualified to make.
I would like to hear why that's being recommended before I comment on it.
So, are we hearing a hold on?
Yeah, just to understand it more.
Okay. Next
The
on
only thing
page
is for-
19, the following definitions can be eliminated. Ambient sound level, broadband sound, flicker, net tower, net metering, power grid, or pure tone, and rated capacity. All those terms have scientific and possible legal definitions.
And these are all definitions from your existing bylaw, so
Right.
But wait a
I
minute.
don't know.
Tom, you're suggesting we eliminate the ambient sound level?
That's the
No, someone
commenters.
else.
A comment from a ZBA member.
I wouldn't.
I mean, oftentimes, the Board of Health regulates that through the state. It's a state guidelines for ambient level. So if somebody is doing, like I was talking about, the crashing of the logs onto a truck that creates an ambient noise level of 20 or something, is above the state upper level, then, I just made that up, 20, it just popped into my head.
It's 10, isn't it?
I don't know where I got it from, but,
10 above ambient.
Yeah, it's 10.
or 10. If not 20, then maybe 10. But I mean, I don't know why you would want to, unless you want to say, refer to the Board of Health, if in fact our Board of Health here does that. But it's usually mandated to the Board of Health.
I think this is far-reaching, and we could have a discussion on it, but I think if Ken brought it up, we should have him here, and he could tell us what he was trying to do.
I don't think it was Ken.
Wasn't?
Well, it's
And
blank, so we don't know.
Well, I'm
it's
guessing.
blank, but I
I'm
don't
sorry,
think that
he's
this
the only
was,
one, who else is missing?
Jerry
Jerry.
and Paul.
Okay.
No, and I think these terms are used in our bylaw. I mean, so to just eliminate the definitions is foolish. I think, and the notion that these are possible legal definitions, everything has a possible legal definition. I think this is like a policy decision for town meeting, not something for us to be doing here in a recodification of the
I
bylaw.
agree.
I agree.
You'd also be gutting
Yes.
the
We'll
bylaw.
be gutting our wind turbine bylaw with one quick
Yes,
definition.
Yeah.
Alrighty, so those are on hold, or if not, right out.
We'd like to hear more why.
Next, a definition of average ground elevation is needed to determine building height on lots that do not have level ground elevation. It should have reference to lots that may have been filled, may have had fill used in the past, i.e. can a property owner go back to the original ground elevation that has been filled in the past XX years? A definition of average ground elevation.
Where is that definition?
It isn't, they're actually
There is-
suggesting an average
And it's needed.
ground
Oh,
definition
it's
needs to be,
needed.
is needed.
Can,
I think I can
Mr.
shed-
Palmer,
yeah,
would you chart?
Maybe I could shed some
Yes.
light on that. So, so let's take maybe a new home being built. To determine the maximum height of 35 feet to the ridge, we typically take where the home is going to be located, the front line of the home, say, as it faces the street, and we take the average grade plane between those corners of the house from left to right, and we take that average grade plane from the lot's natural state, the natural elevation. So you're placing the home here, the average grade plane between the two corners, you might have an elevation of 10 here, an elevation of 5 here, so we would have an elevation of 7.5, that's the average grade plane. So the peak of that roof would be 35 feet from that average grade plane. And I think perhaps what the person who had that comment, maybe their thoughts were, well, if we have this home that was built 25 years ago, and now we have this home that's been built, and now they want to maybe put a second story on it, or an addition or something, how do they go back in time and establish 35 feet from the average grade plane where the home might have been filled in, or the lot might have been altered from its natural state? So I'm not quite sure what this person is suggesting, but I think I understand their concern. If that makes any sense.
It does,
Yeah.
since there are developments that are on fill.
And it's particularly sensitive with the floodplain issues we deal with in our town.
Somewhere in the back of my mind, this all arose from a house that was built on Elm Road by Mrs. Ritchie back in the
Yeah,
80s.
and they made a mountain and put it on top of it.
Yes, she did. And I think we tried to cure it at that time by putting the word natural. So if you built up the lot and then came in for your building permit, you went back to the 1975 topo maps the town has. And you can determine that was that natural grade, say, 10 years beforehand. And that was what we would use. So it's one of those complicated things. But I see the point. Try to
So you
Try
work
to,
on it?
So is that what the building department uses?
That's what I used to use in the past. We would use air photos. We have a very sophisticated GIS system now that has air photos all the way back to the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. So we can get a pretty good idea if something's been filled in. But I see the person's point. You'd like to be able to sort how you institutionalize that and put it in your definitions, but it's going to take a little work. But we understand the point.
Bob?
I think it's one of those things that you're trying to create a blanket policy that's gonna cover everything, and I don't
It
think it's
can't,
possible.
And that's why simple is good, but we'll take a look at it. I'll take a look at it.
Well, then what comes to my mind is a house built on the side of a steep hill, and if you have the 2 points in front, and there's a 10-foot drop-off, it goes, house is 45 feet high from the back, and I think that's an issue too, but I guess your call is you go by the midpoint of the two fronts, and the slope's the slope.
Yes, that's exactly what we do.
That's what we need to understand, and I'm okay with that, but
Yeah. That's a building department issue.
that's
They
their
handle,
call,
and
yeah.
We shouldn't mess with it.
Yeah, I really think that you can write your definition, we'll put it in here, but what you said sounded great.
That's how we interpret it now, that's.
I think that's the way it should
There
be.
hasn't been any problems, and I've been fortunate enough not to have to go back to the 1975 books.
And in my experience, Brian, the maps aren't there, it's plus or minus a foot sometimes. The area, when they do the topos, take a look at how many lomas have been granted with houses in the middle of the floodplain, and they come and engineer and they're out, and they're not in it, so that, they're not that accurate.
It's plus or minus certain on the horizontal and plus or minus certain on the vertical, but it's better than nothing.
Yes.
All right, and there's one more. Should the definition of mean sea level be eliminated since new HUD floodplain maps use a revised datum definition, or cite a FEMA, or should a FEMA site be referenced? That is, page 9, mean sea level.
My suggestion here, when there are state or federal definitions that are incorporated by reference into a bylaw, they, whatever those numbers are as of the date of enactment, but those are moving targets, so maps change from time to time. And that doesn't change the bylaw. If the bylaw references a map at time T1 and at time T2, it's different federal number, the town has to catch up by amending its zoning bylaw. It can't delegate the number to a federal or a state agency. So even though a state or a federal agency has defined a term, or if the bylaw refers to a decision of another agency, it doesn't automatically change the meaning within the bylaw unless the town meeting actually changes the bylaw to conform to it. So it's just a risk when you depend upon determinations made other than by the town meeting.
Ron, what's the date? We changed the,
July 14th, 2014,
And it's, you know, but
for new flood maps,
Yeah.
if that's what your question was.
so you also, Mr. Chairman, you also have to make the distinction between the flood maps and, which are based on national, the NAT 88, we call it.
but this is,
A lot
sorry,
of-
go ahead.
And what we're talking about here is this, is the vertical datum of 1929. So if you go to your setbacks and your, the ponds and the sea level, that's what you're using. We're not really in floodplain zone. So if you want to eliminate that, that's really not what you want to do. You may want to go to
Oh, you're
revise
saying
it
this
to
is a
90 days.
horizontal?
There's horizontal and there's vertical.
Right.
But, you know, but we want to make sure that if you don't want to use the vertical datum of 1929, then we'll rely on the vertical datum of 88 or whatever it might be, but you don't want to eliminate it.
No, I know, I just want to pick the right one. I think it was 88, and hasn't it changed to another date? I don't remember.
I don't know.
On the elevation certificates, they used to refer to 88, and now there's a new date, and I can't recall what it was.
But we can take a look at that. But
Take a
make
look at the
make the
current-
distinction between flood zones and non-flood zones. So right now, you're talking about flood zones.
Thank you, I just wanted to make sure that those got into the discussion.
In fact, Judge
If
Caution.
I may,
Yes, Ron?
if I may, just make one comment on page 6, under structure, second paragraph. It reads, page 6, structure, second paragraph, under structure at the top. It reads, "The structure includes but is not limited to tennis or similar sports courts, swimming pools if more than 24 inches deep, or 250 square feet in area." Might I suggest, only because I don't know where the 250 square feet came from. It's not in any building code, so I'm not sure where it came from. Might I suggest that, we strike, after swimming pools, we strike if more than 24 inches deep or 250 square feet in area, as defined in the Massachusetts State Building Code 780 CMR. Suggestion, the building code has a very clear definition for swimming pools, as opposed to 250 or 24 inches.
All good with that? You deal with that.
I have a question off of that, also related to structure. I don't mean to jump off. I am on board with what you're suggesting. Something that we've been seeing a lot lately at the zoning board is this issue of whether a raised patio, a reinforced patio with rebar is a structure. So usually a landscaping patio feature is landscaping. People are trying to get, we count, decks affixed to the building as a structure. It appears some people are trying to get around lot coverage issues by building reinforced with rebar patios that are probably more substantial in a lot of circumstances than decks, but traditionally patios have been viewed as landscaping features and not included in lot coverage. So that might be something, I know we say, but not including retaining walls. There was an issue whether a patio constituted a retaining wall. So that might be something, I don't know if you have any insight on that, Rod.
That was gonna be my comment number
Okay,
2,
okay.
that we maybe look at retaining walls and perhaps add something to them, only because retaining walls they've evolved to symmetrical masonry units that can be stacked 30 feet in the air. Perhaps there might be some thought put into having retaining walls greater than 6 feet or less than 6 feet, or have some height limitation on it. Because yes, that has become a problem. Retaining walls essentially can be built at any height. It could be 8 feet, could be 10 feet,
Do you see this house in Falmouth Heights?
and it's challenging for us to prohibit those.
I'll show you.
So that would be my second comment. Thank you.
If I could just ask Rod, going back to your first comment, did you state the CMR on the state
Yes.
building code?
Yeah, so I thought perhaps if, after swimming pools, we wrote, as defined in the Massachusetts State Building Code, 780 CMR, maybe that could be in parentheses.
780 CMR?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
So you would strike if more than 24 inches deep or 250 square feet in area. I'm not sure, there might be an additional 2 on that first sentence too. It says,
Limited to 2?
yeah, I'm not good at finding grammatical errors.
Is
but-
not limited to 2 twos, okay, 2 twos.
That's for the small swimming pool. Yes, Pam.
Could I just change all the punctuation on that then?
if you're changing it to the correct punctuation, yes.
Well, I'll give it a shot. A structure includes but is not limited to, tennis or smaller sports carts.
Similar.
Or similar. Swimming pools as defined by whatever.
Okay, cool.
And then there's another colon there, so you don't need the and. Gas or liquid storage tanks if principally above ground. And then you don't need that colon, that semicolon, comma, but not including retaining walls or fences.
Bob is the grammarian of the team, so that's why I look to him.
I appreciate the use of semicolons when you have a series.
But you have to start it with a colon.
Yeah, you do.
When you start listing.
So that's a good thing, then use semicolons thereafter. But my question is, the last change you make, changing the semicolon before but to a comma, is that what you were recommending?
Or liquid storage tanks if principally above ground,
Yeah.
then you don't need anything, but not including retaining walls or fences.
Well, does,
There should be a.
not including retaining walls, does that relate to the liquid storage tanks, or all of the series?
No,
All of the series?
I would think
Yes.
I
there's,
think it's related to
Yeah.
the whole series.
It's the whole series.
This
Yeah.
series.
So it should really be a period, and then you could start, a structure shall not include
I
a
like that.
retaining wall, not to exceed 6 feet, or whatever it may be, or fences.
I like that, because that eliminates the ambiguity.
yeah, because you have what's
Yeah.
there and then what's not included. You're right.
Or reinforce.
one
for
principle
hard
of
patios.
Clarifies.
One principle of drafting suggests that you define globally that when you use the word including, it is non-exhaustive. So to say, but, including but not limited to, the not limited to is redundant and superfluous. So if you define your use of the term including as being open-ended and non-exclusive, you save having to repeat that phrase over and over again. Because if you don't repeat the phrase over and over again, the argument could be made that maybe you do mean it to be exclusive. So there is a risk in using it. My own preference is not to repeat that expression, but to define your consistent use of the word including as by default meaning something that is not inclusive, not exclusive.
Charlotte, you had something?
I
Does that
did.
make
It's
sense?
Going back
Yes,
to a
thank you.
broad suggestion that you use as defined by information contained in another document. And I wonder if one of the general principles here in the recodification is to try to make this a self-contained document to the extent that it's practical to do that. So someone would not have to now go and find this state code, but would be able to know what the state code said. So I wonder, is the swimming pool definition so long that that's impractical, or?
Probably not. The definition right now states swimming pool, any structure intended for swimming or recreation bathing that contains water more than 24 inches deep.
Rod, how frequently did they change the state building code?
It's constantly evolving, but most definitions, such as swimming pools, are fairly stable and don't change too often. But that one is relatively new in that they've included with the intention for swimming. So before, it was any body of water greater than 24 inches deep had to be safeguarded, but because it became a problem, they've included that language that bodies of water greater than 24 inches with the intention for swimming.
I share your concern about defining a term locally by reference to some other regulatory entity that periodically defines and changes the terms. When reference is made to FEMA maps, for example, the Attorney General insists that you put the date of the map in question, because when FEMA maps change, it is inapplicable locally unless town meeting changes it. So if you put, in accordance with the FEMA map of a particular date, as amended, the Attorney General will strike the as amended, routinely strike that. So I'm apprehensive about depending on some other legislature's definition of a term. If you like what's in the CMR, put it in there with a date, so that if the state changes it, you can go ahead and change your bylaw accordingly.
Okay.
Or actually use a definition that doesn't require going somewhere else to get that information. I think your point is well taken.
Thank you.
So back to structure, we're gonna use the definition, 24 inches as opposed for swimming, and what did we decide
Well, I
about
can read it
retaining
to, I'll read it to you again, Tom. It says, any structure intended for swimming or recreational bathing that contains water more than 24 inches deep. So it's really not much different in that it just doesn't include the 250 square feet.
And what did we decide about retaining walls, as far as the structure, but not including retaining walls?
I think,
That was a separate sentence.
I don't think we want to get into sort of regulating thumb walls, but I think the point is taken, just like a fence needs certain permits over a certain height, maybe retaining walls over a certain height meets the definition. So that's what I have in my notes here, to take a look at something along those lines.
And that's a
We'll
good
draft something
example,
up.
if I might, that's a good example, Brian, in that the building code, up until last year,
Of course.
fences less than 6 feet didn't require a permit. And they've changed it, now it's 7 feet. So if it's less than 7, it doesn't require, and it is not considered a structure under the building code.
Right.
So there's a constant evolution of changing.
So I think we tie it into something that quacks like a duck. Yeah.
What's next?
So just before we leave definitions, like in all these sections, if you are continuing, and I hope continuing reviewing these, please feed your recommendations to Tom so that we can keep seeing what what you find, what you think, and we can make, we can be making changes and not have to wait a month before we see you again or something like that. So,
Let's do one quick typo.
sure.
On page 15, under residential dwelling, housing-related terms, under family, an individual residing in one dwelling.
Unknit,
So,
as opposed to a knit dwelling.
Yeah.
It's an
That would be what, that no man put asunder on knitting?
unit, okay, thanks.
Can I just ask something too, but going back to the structure? That sentence seems to not be completed.
What page is that on now?
On page 6, it says, "Any combination of repair, reconstruction, rehabilitation, addition, or other improvement of a structure performed within any 12-month period, the cumulative cost of which equals or exceeds 50% of the market value of the structure before the initial improvement or repair is started." What? I mean, it seems to be, it's not a complete.
Is that, where else?
That's the structure substantial improvement, page 6.
Okay.
I think that's fine.
I don't know, I'll have to look to see if that's the exact language in your bylaw, or if I misinterpreted it, or if your bylaw's always been wrong, and we'll, whatever it is, we'll fix it.
I think I might be able to shed a little light on that.
Oh, okay.
So if there's a substantial improvement on a home and the value of the improvement is greater than 50%, there can be, or I should say, the amount of money being spent on that home is accumulative for a period of 12 months. And the clock begins to start ticking when you start the work. So if you obtain a building permit today for repairs or improvements on a home that's within a flood hazard area that's non-conforming, you cannot spend more than 50% of the value of the structure, and that 50% is accumulative for a period of 12 months, and the clock begins to tick when you start the work. And I think that's what they mean by that. And if you read the next sentence, it sort of defines it. For the purposes of this definition, substantial improvement starts when the first alteration of any wall, ceiling, floor, or other structural part of the building commences. So you might pull a building permit today, but you don't start the work until next month. The clock doesn't begin to tick until you start the work. So I think that's what they're trying, that's how I've interpreted this.
It just
Enforced
seems, it seems to end
Yeah,
just out of nowhere.
it started, yeah.
It started and
Right.
then,
So that is what I explained to homeowners and contractors.
makes
So,
sense.
and this is very unique in the state of Massachusetts. I believe it's the only town in the state of Massachusetts that has this unique bylaw.
And this evolved right after Hurricane Bob in 1992, when people came crashing in for permits and whatnot. So I think Mr. Gore and I put that language together. But if you find it a little bit more nebulous today, we can take a peek at it.
I have a question for Ron on that. So if you pull your permit and you want it to start right away, you go down and do something the next day? A very small task, and you document it, and that's the day the work starts?
Yes, and when building permits are issued, I don't know when they start. But unless I'm told otherwise, I assume that they start that very day.
Can somebody come in and apply for an extension?
Yes, they can. And if they come in for an extension, for a 6-month extension, then again, the clock doesn't begin to tick.
That might be something that would be useful to add to this.
But isn't this used primarily to accelerate the time frame, so they don't have to do the 50% to get it started again? The cumulative dollar amount, you want it to, most of the time, this is being used for it to happen quickly rather than slowing down.
Well, this puts people, this may put people at a disadvantage. If you were to go to, say, another town, and you were to, for easy understanding, if the home were worth $100,000 and you did $49,999 worth of work, you would not have to bring the house into compliance. Once the work was complete and you closed that permit out a month later, you could do something else and spend another $49,900. But here in Falmouth, you have to wait a year.
That's what I was getting at. I was trying to figure out we have many, many people in our town that are finished the work in 6 months and sit there and wait.
Right.
And then they do another 50%, they sit there and wait, so projects take 3 years. There's all kinds of examples. Didn't you bring this up, weren't you and I talking
Yeah,
about this?
I had suggested to the planning board that that be deleted in its entirety.
Yeah.
Well, is this the time to do it?
So that's up to the township.
Or, no, that actually has to go to town meeting level, so we couldn't do it here.
Right,
Well, this is going to town meeting.
Well, everything has to go to town meeting.
right, everything
But
else.
this is a point you have already brought up.
Yes.
Yeah.
You want to research the history of why it went in before you delete it.
My opinion is that so many of our houses are in the floodplain, and it's becoming harder and harder for homeowners to do anything. If we could, I think if we could get it to work for, a faster process, it would be a good thing. Not the right place, Brian?
Your timing is everything, so, I suggest a little bit more background, history, why this went in, and what happens if it comes out, so we don't find ourselves in a 3-night town meeting.
And part of our goal is not, in some cases, that we really don't want them to rebuild in the velocity zone. We want to use it.
You have to go back to your vision, you have to go back to why you're doing this, and if you want to have a certain vision, you want to have a certain built landscape, then you need to make sure you don't take the tool away that tries to ensure that.
I think this may need a bigger hearing on this one subject.
You bet.
Tom?
And that was the conversation that Rod and I had after the planning board meeting. We talked about this, where I was moving forward with the things that we talked about. And what I said to Rod, I said, well, considering our emphasis on coastal resilience and our concern about, sea level rise, do we want to make it easier for someone to take a house in the velocity zone and expand it exponentially as quickly as they can, or do we want more of an incremental change in expanding a structure that's in these areas? And so at that point, I just said, well, maybe we want to sort of pause on that particular one. And that was the conversation I had with Rod, which is why I didn't advance it.
I think it probably needs a hearing on the subject because it could change from zone to zone. I mean, I think certainly in the velocity zone, we have to be really careful. But some places up in AE 15 and you're at the 14-foot level and all you're trying to do is a little work and you have to sit there for 3 years to go through the process. We probably need to discuss that, this one subject at one time.
Jim?
Yes,
You guys are looking at it when floodplains and all this. I'm looking at it from the little guy in Hatchville, like my little house, which is appraised at $350,000. If I want to put an addition, another room, expand the kitchen or something, I'm looking at $300,000. So then I would have to upgrade my entire house in order to put a little addition on, what the cost of things are, if you're going by the value of the structure itself. So, to me, that's a burden. I mean, I don't see myself ever being able to do that.
Because of the floodplain?
No,
Not-
because of
nothing to
this
do with, because of
non-
because of having to bring the rest of the house up to
insulation,
code.
plumbing,
Yeah.
all the other building code issues.
Non-conforming.
So just make sure the board understands, this only
Right.
affects those structures in flood hazard zones. If you're up in Hatchville, this does not apply to you.
Does it?
Well, anything goes
Unless you want to start regulating the 500-year flood. But no.
Okay,
we're-
see,
we're-
I
we're
was
in-
thinking floodplain, but I was just trying
I
to,
thought it was any
No, no,
structure.
this is just in flood hazard zone.
Yeah, the next paragraph, in the purposes of this definition in the velocity zones.
And we have an enhanced requirement in these zones.
I'm sorry, I was
Okay.
thinking
Oh, okay.
other things.
Now you
It's-
can go
If
do
it's
your
limited to the velocity zone, that has a special purpose.
Yeah, I think that's what we, if it's not, we'll make sure we talk about that, but that's where you find, I think, all that language.
I missed that side
That's
of
why
it
that language
altogether.
was put in right after Hurricane Bob, and it applies to these flood hazard zones. What a day that was. It was the day after race weekend. Did you know that?
To prevent people from
that?
mentioning their houses.
Yeah. We need to get back to zones.
Go ahead.
Could we consider adding a definition for raise, as in raise and reconstruct?
For what?
The word raise, like in raise and reconstruct, we get a lot of applications in. So a definition of what is actually the definition for a raise on a building?
We certainly can look at that. That's an interesting term. I don't think.
We just hear it a lot, but it's not in the definitions at all.
We've had recent issues with that during some hearings as to what exactly a raise and reconstruct is.
Okay, well, we'll certainly look into that one. That'll be an interesting one. Okay,
Intervene, Bob, go ahead.
so the uses in the tables, in the zoning districts and everything, there were 3 articles, Article 6, Article 7, Article 8. Article 6 is zoning districts and use tables, Article 7, overlay districts, and Article 8, a special district. So, because of the way your bylaw, even with uses, is so scattered all over it, we're trying to figure out the best way to combine. And so these are the 3 broad headings, because you have your main zoning districts, which are, in the zoning world, are referred to as base zoning district. Your residential, agricultural, industrial, business, public use, marine district, that are on your zoning maps as base districts, so you're familiar. And then you have all your overlay districts, which go on top of the base districts, that, the accident prevention district, and I forgot what else is there, search and rescue, and water resources, and all of those overlay districts that overlay the existing district. And then you have one kind of outlying district that we came up with, calling it a special district, working with Brian, which is the ACEC, Areas of Critical Environmental Concern, which doesn't quite fit into the other 2 categories. So that's the overarching organization of this material. And then And then we took, and again, most of what you see in these tables and these standards and conditions are existing language. Some of it's tweaked, where you can see where we tweaked it, and we spent enormous amounts of hours on this, going back and forth with Brian and Attorney Duffy, trying to understand your bylaw, because you know what happens when you take all these endless words and put them into tables? It pops out at you as to, wait a minute, why is this used here and not there, and, you know, how did this, you know, things are duplicative, things are inconsistent, there are inconsistent sections in here, so, and you'll see some of these, some of those notes and footnotes. But, so, a couple of just overall questions. Are we going in the right direction by putting everything into tables, which we were asked to do? We think it's a whole lot easier to read this than your current bylaw. And then, the other issue, and this came up a little bit when we met last time, I know, because you have so many standards and conditions embedded into your uses, our first cut at this was to put those in the table. So you have the use, the standards and conditions, and then the zoning district and how they're allowed, you know, how that use is allowed or not allowed, yes, no. And so you can see, some of them have pretty, you know, just a couple of small standards and conditions, and then others, you know, just go on and on and on and on and on and on. So this is one way to do that. And, you know, again, this is pros and cons of doing it different ways. Another way that some communities do it that have lots of standards and conditions is to footnote them. So you just have the table, and then underneath the table are the footnote 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, with endless language. So the standards and conditions, sometimes it works well, but sometimes the longer the standard and condition is, it starts disappearing on, you know, on 2 pages later from where the table is. But that's, you know, that's another way of looking at this. And so as you are reading these and looking at these, you know, we would like to ask you to take a look at the structure of the table, the uses, the standards, and then, you know, how they're allowed in what zoning districts. And again, because you have, for a couple of reasons, and again, working with Brian's advice, you have so many zoning districts in Falmouth, it would be, some towns, and I think planning board member Harris gave me a copy of the Provincetown. Well, they only have like 6 or 7 zones, so they fit them all on one page. But for all their zones, and smaller towns can do that, but because you have so many, we broke it into, you look under the agricultural district, and you look under the residential districts, you have them all the residential, you have all the industrial, et cetera, as a way of trying to organize all of this. So that's where we are, and we're looking on feedback for that. And then the other piece of, just like the definition section, is, okay, this is what's in your bylaw. Some of these things are in the delete section. They're not in here, they're in the delete section. Like church, the word church, we deleted that and replaced it with religious institution to kind of get on the right side of the Constitution, you know? Things like that. Telephone exchange, when was the last time somebody came in for a permit for a telephone exchange in any town, let alone Falmouth? You know, so there's archaic terms, there are terms that have red flags legally. And then, as has been previously noted, because your municipal uses were so differently treated from zoning category to, some categories didn't allow any zoning, any municipal uses. Some allowed fire departments, but not police departments. And as we went through it, there didn't seem to be any rationale as to how they were treated. So we came up with a proposal that, all right, let's put municipal uses in one category. If they're not otherwise prohibited or a special permit use, they're allowed. And we've got our marching orders to kind of look into the definitions of what that all means. But that's a big piece of this that we change from how your existing bylaw is structured. And then throughout here, in some places, you'll see footnotes. And if you look in Article 6, under page 8, the footnote about your restaurant category, how restaurants are treated in town, that whole section needs a thorough analysis.
The matrix are you talking about?
The what?
The restaurant matrix?
The whole thing, because one of the things we found, and then this was a particular area, you have, in your restaurant matrix, you have certain categories of restaurant, but in your uses, you have other categories of restaurants that aren't in the matrix. You have zones where in the first part of the zone, it says these types of restaurants, class 1,
Class A,
class
B, C,
2,
and
or
D,
whatever it is, are allowed in these zones.
Class
And
one.
then 3 pages later, it's the same class restaurants are listed that say it's not allowed in that zone. So one says it's allowed, one says it's not allowed, one says it's a special permit.
We're working on it.
No, not, so that's a little beyond, quite frankly, what we were asked to do is to rewrite a whole big section. But we're identifying the problems with it, and we're working with Brian, and Tom will have to get involved in this too. So at some point, you're gonna have to really, because there's policy issues in there in terms of what kind of restaurants you wanna allow, where, and everything. So,
This is really fairly important because this evolved around franchises and franchise-free Woods Hole, and for a long time, this was a really big deal. That's what created this.
Right, so when we get there, I'll give you some background, some history. Restaurants, fast food and restaurants, and then this new matrix that came in around, right after the McDonald's wanted to go into Woods Hole.
Right.
Remember, a lot of zoning evolved from food fights.
Oh, yeah,
From what?
Food
food
fights.
fights.
food fight.
Yeah, donut wars, pizza wars,
Oh,
Hamburger wars.
hamburger,
okay.
coffee
We've had a lot of
wars.
food wars in this town over a long period of time.
That's true. Can't make it up.
Excuse me,
Go ahead.
Bob, I hate to beat a dead horse here, but Bob actually made a good example of the confusion when we spoke of substantial damage and substantial improvements. And would it not be wise to indicate what that is applicable to? And as Brian had said,
Yeah,
for flood hazard areas, and this is a good example of where, when you read this, you would not know that it's applicable to, especially under substantial damage that,
Yeah.
Right.
Right, because the language that implements it's found in the flood zone.
Yeah, so if there was some way to,
I've got that in my notes.
okay, thank you.
So there's no,
Charlotte?
That came up on Site Triangle also. It would be very specialized knowledge to know that that's just for private property.
yeah, it's also in your landscaping bylaw. We're not getting into street or driveway design under landscaping, but we'll make sure.
One more,
So-
Charlotte? No, Charlotte has one more. Go ahead.
Right, where are cell phones in this use table?
Cell
Cell
phones.
phones in
Cell
here?
towers?
Cell towers?
It's, I believe it falls under the general rubric of a tower.
Well, you've got
Yeah.
television and radio antennas
Right.
subjects, but I couldn't find cell towers anywhere in our old zoning book.
Yeah, I
Yeah, I
think,
think it's been under,
I don't think
I
it's
should
in
know
there.
this because we've
Yeah.
permitted them.
yeah, you permit them, right?
I think it is under
Something.
radio towers,
It's
what we
under radio
use.
antenna towers.
Yeah.
Right.
Some of the, that's a good question, and I think this falls into the category I'm going to mention, but I can't find it at the moment. Some of your bigger uses, if you will, you have entire sections devoted to, and it was, among the discussion with everything, was to leave those as, and I wish I could find this, specific. Let me see if I can find this. Leave those, not try to put these whole big multi-page use sections, squeeze it into the use table, but to leave them as special regulations, something like that. I can't remember what the word was.
Well, they don't show up in definitions, and there's not a utility section, so you just can't get there from here.
Yes, actually you can, if I could find what I'm looking for, but they would be in the bylaw. Here we go. So special, we have special use regulations for things like adult uses, affordable housing developments, commercial accommodations, marijuana centers, wind energy, planned residential, those kinds of bigger uses that come with so many conditions and procedures and everything in your bylaw. We felt it would be really hard to get all of that stuffed into a table, and those are really special kinds of bigger uses that have been adopted more recently by the town.
So it would be sort of a none of the above category?
None of the above.
Yeah, if it hadn't appeared somewhere else, it might be in special uses, you're saying.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
It sounds as if what you're saying is if you can't find it anywhere else, you could look under special uses.
Yeah, so the table of contents, so that would be its own separate article.
Mm-hmm.
And so the table of contents,
Article 8.
would have article, I don't know right now exactly what the number is, because we're still moving things around. Special use regulations, and then, it would have the uses that I just listed and some more. So, and that's pretty common in zoning bylaws, where you have these, things like adult uses or wind energy, or, they're much bigger and they're more specific to certain parts of the town, and they're certainly more specific in terms of all the procedures and regulations that are put into them to help guide the boards that review them. So right now, that's the proposal, is the way they would go. All those special kinds of uses would have their own article, and in the table of contents, you could find it very easily.
So we'd see that at another time.
Hmm?
She said, we'll see that at another time.
Oh, yeah, you're gonna see a lot more at another time.
Pam?
Why wouldn't the cell tower be sort of coupled with television or radio antennas exceeding 50 feet above ground level? Why couldn't you insert cell towers, which are clearly more than 50 feet above ground level?
Good.
I mean, I'm just thinking, when you start thinking about cell towers, I usually think of radio antennas or TV towers or whatever they're called. It just seems to fit into that same, what you said, utility kind of.
We could do that, yeah, I mean, just a simple in-app plug-in, plug in and
Right.
place. We could do that, I
I
mean,
think that's what we've
That's the
relied
practice.
upon. Oh, excuse me, sorry.
That's the practice today.
Yeah.
So we'll plug it in with the radio and TV antennas.
Makes sense to me.
That's what made sense back in,
now, but the issue, we're gonna have to think about that, because cell towers have their own federal statutes about where they're allowed, how they're allowed, what the town can do to regulate them. It's not just the town's decision about cell towers.
Right.
So we may not be able to just plug it in with the other category, we might have to create a
That's
separate
true.
line, a separate row.
That's true. I think what the town can do, though, they can limit the number of providers that can tack on to one tower. I think the town has the right to, I think we had 7 in our town, and I think I forgot what the, it was the FCC?
Yeah,
Would that be the?
FCC, yeah.
Yeah, they allowed more, and the town sort of did a home rule so that we could undercut those numbers because it was causing too much interference, so they limited it to a certain number.
Yeah, and
It is
the other thing, just to be, you may already be aware of this, the legislation on cell towers at the federal level changes
Daily,
fairly regularly,
right?
and often against what the towns and cities and counties would like to see. So we'll put it in, and
It's worth having. Anyone who lives in a part of town with bad reception looks
We
it
do.
up. So they want to be able to find it.
right.
Are you talking about
I ain't saying that, but, you know.
West Falmouth, for example.
And North Falmouth, terrible.
Yeah, we use it, like, it's been a special permit process, so they would come apply to us for, and I've only been on the board 4 years, but we did have an application, special permit, there was some dispute as to the location. I think it was ultimately denied, but then it was overturned. Anyways, I was on the right side of that, so but it is a special permit criteria that we utilize. But then we have to consider some of the other considerations at the federal level as well.
It's always good to consider.
So for cell towers, we'll probably put those like the special use districts because there are certain federal preemptions and state preemptions.
And that section would be referenced in the index, C, section so-and-so, right?
Yeah, we'll probably have it, in that, like Bob says, in that special use districts like we have for adult uses over in towers. We'll probably put it there.
So if you go to page 11 of Article 6, again, this is another weird piece of your bylaw that, and you have a lot of really good pieces, so we're not talking about the good stuff, we're talking about how to fix the other stuff, so we don't want to give you the impression that the whole bylaw is bad. You have a lot of really
I'm getting a
good.
complex, and I just
Good,
got here.
good. Wait till you see what I'm doing to Kingston's bylaw.
Thank you.
Tom doesn't care anymore.
He's going to.
Yeah, I'm working for Kingston to redo, maybe I shouldn't say anything more.
On advice of counsel, you might want to just.
Yeah, so, here's a section about RDNA, and because this reflects a lot of bylaws, some issue comes up, and a zoning bylaw gets passed to deal with that issue, and then 20 years later, people go, well, what's this about? But the odd thing here is, you adopted a bylaw that said that it would not go into effect until the Board of Health adopted regulations. Now, that's really bizarre to begin with, because, you adopt bylaws, town meeting adopts the zoning bylaw and goes into effect when they adopt it. But, I asked Brian, well, did the Board of Health ever do this? And, he doesn't know. So, who knows if this thing ever went into effect, but it's 25 years old based on what some other board did or didn't do. Either there should be some research into this, although or it should just be deleted, because you're having a bylaw not go into effect until some other board does something, and not knowing whether 25 years later, whether they did it or not. It's a problem.
Yeah.
I doubt the Board of Health ever did any regulations. I think my memory is still serving me, even though I wasn't on the board at that time, that I believe this was the time when the MBL was wanting to get involved, and perhaps the oceanographic, but I believe it was the only MBL, in DNA research. They were getting more involved in medical research, which is currently not going on. And as I recall, the town was extremely concerned that they could develop something that would get loose into the environment.
Right.
And so that was why the Board of Health was put in there. As far as I know, the MBL has not gone ahead with any of this. So I suspect at this point, it could just be stricken.
Godzilla.
Yep, Godzilla, exactly. Mhm.
Yeah, I think it all evolved out of the Main Street, when the lab was on Main Street. It's the mutual bank today. And there are some concerns. I want to say that was a floor amendment, Bob. But I remember we simply said, well, if we get an application, we'll check in with the Board of Health. Because we never had an application for, our DNA research. So my sense is,
Gone.
yeah, I don't think you're gonna have to worry about it. There are other, some of the things we'll be talking about are over the years, other tools have become available. Conservation commissions, boards of health. Back in the 70s and 80s, everything was sort of thrown into zoning bylaws. We have wetlands in the zoning bylaw because in the 60s, there were no conservation commissions. So you'll be seeing me, or hearing me go back to that. Is this the right tool? Is zoning the right tool today for specifically our DNA research? Probably not. And it probably should come out because other jurisdictions have preemptions, or the Board of Health has regulations today that gets into these things. We don't have to concern ourselves under zoning. Right. You may just want to look at the use. The use is either allowed or not allowed, but we don't need to get into what the Board of Health does.
So I don't know if people have comments, questions, edits, thoughts on the tables. Again, it just, without getting into details, I really would draw your attention to the footnotes, because there's questions and policy questions, which don't all have to be decided during this process. Some of these are pretty big policy questions that, might be the next phase that the town needs to consider, but whatever direction you can give us, over the next month, really, what's in the table, what's not in the table, like cell towers, or other things, or if you have questions, like we have questions, we try to, so I don't know if people have comments now.
I have a comment. I'm a end user. I really like the table format a lot better. It's a lot faster to just go this way and find it. Write down the list, as opposed to reading all the different things. Some of the times you go through the whole thing, and then you'll find an exemption way down the bottom that you didn't even know about, and that you go in and they say, yeah, but you didn't read all the way to the bottom of the page,
Right.
So I like to have it. I'm very much in favor of myself.
And the other thing, just to point out, each individual section, like residential use, the blue section, everything that's listed under those, they're all in alphabetical order again, which is not the case in your bylaw today.
Charlotte, you had something?
I did. I second that. I think the tables are wonderful. As a tool, they're just so much better and easier to use. I am wondering, there are a few red marks in here where there are changes suggested, but very few. When we first got started on this, Brian would say, well, we just don't have ice houses anymore, and some things ought to be dropped. And I wonder, Brian, particularly if you've been through it, and your thoughts on what we could get rid of, like the RDNA, if I got the acronym right. I noted, they're already here.
I think there is a table in there of our suggested deletions that you can take a look at. Some folks say, well, we like to keep ice houses for at least nostalgic purposes. It's just this history of the town, and who knows, there might be a revitalization of that use, who knows? Keep it in there. But we want to sort of hear from you tonight about what you think should or shouldn't be in there.
Pat?
My comment still stands on municipal uses being thrown into every zoning. Every little piece of zoning could have a municipal use in it. And unless you specifically exclude any use. And I think when we do these things, it's going to be very difficult to keep in mind that, we've got to exclude municipal uses if we don't want certain things in certain residential areas. So I think, let's say residential areas, but there may be other things. And so I really do object to that being throughout. and specifically more so even because there's no definition as to what might be municipal use. And I understand, Bob, your concern about keeping it too tightly constrained. I do understand that too, so the whole thing plays together. On page 5, under commercial nursery, I completely agree that we have to, and that was discussed earlier, that we have to look at what a nursery is. But the special, excuse me, the special permit group is the planning board on that. You have it as the zoning board.
Oh, okay.
So you're on page 7 of Article 6?
Page 5.
Page 5,
Page 5.
Commercial nursery.
commercial nursery,
All right.
special permit planning, okay, thanks.
Let's see.
Oh, yeah,
On
plan.
page 7, there's a number 3, but there's nothing there. Was that just somebody hit the bar and a number 3 cropped up? Or was there something left out under mixed use, residential and commercial mixed use? Number 3.
There's a what?
There's a number 3, page 7, under mixed use. 1, 2, 3, there's nothing there.
It's on our draft, but not yours, Bob.
Oh, yeah, because mine doesn't have a 3, it just has a 1 and a 2.
Mine's got a
They
3.
got that one, it's got a 3 on it.
Well, that's weird, how could, because it was printed off of this, when did that 3 come? Straight
Spooky
3.
stuff going on.
Fat fingers, but I didn't type.
All right, well, I don't, that's weird, but I'll fix that.
It may be one of those automatic numbers that Bill Gates kicks in when you hit the carriage return.
Could be also be in an accessory structure.
So if,
Page 17. The purpose of the marine, put in district there, under purpose. It's the first line.
Oh, the Marine District.
Mhm. Oh, on page 26, you had the policy question. Note that this amnesty provision expired 1 year from the date of its adoption. It appears that this was adopted in 2004. Since it has expired, all of the subsection 11 should be deleted unless the town considers just deleting the language regarding the 1 year expiration, thus keeping this amnesty provision. The reason we put this, as I recall, into being is that there were a number of illegal dwelling units, and we wanted to bring those into the fold, so to speak. And so I think it does take a serious discussion as to whether we want to delete the expiration on that and say, just keep it open if they.
This is
because
the
we're
amnesty
trying to-
bylaw that they put together to pregnant, and we only gave them a year to step up?
That's correct. It's under conversion of a dwelling unit into multiple units. We want to encourage multifamily dwellings. And so I think this can take a serious discussion here as to how we want to handle it.
I'm in favor of the amnesty because I think this gets misused all the time. And people use it, they say, yeah, it's been, I mean,
It's
that was.
grandfathered.
It's grandfathered, yeah. And if the reason why we did this, we gave them a put up or shut up date. We said, okay, if you have one of these, you got a year to get it done, and if you don't do it by now, that's it.
You're illegal.
And we did it to solve the problem so they don't keep cropping up.
So I think we shouldn't just be making a decision tonight. It's expired, but I think we need to talk seriously about continuing.
Doesn't it mean there's no more amnesty?
That's correct.
Yeah, so that's what was the intent, was to limit to a year when we passed
Correct,
it.
but do we want to? Because we want to
You
encourage
want to
multifamily.
revisit,
Yeah.
okay, you want to revisit because of our housing. Okay, I get your point.
Just bringing that up. Otherwise, sure, it's expired, get rid of it, but it's a policy decision here.
So are we hearing, did I hear you want to just simply delete it while you have a policy discussion to resurrect it, or do you want to leave it in?
I'm not making any recommendation right now
Well,
tonight.
then
know
we'll
She's,
that
I
we
think you're
got
questioning, he wants to take away the date on it.
the date of expiration on it right now.
But you haven't made a decision, I'm
But we
sorry.
haven't made a decision, she
We
wants
haven't
to
even
talk.
discussed it.
We want to, it ain't an agenda item,
We'll keep it.
Bob.
And honestly, you know, I'd love to hear ZBA's take on that too.
Yeah, you're the ones that, you're the special permit granting authority there, so.
Yeah, I think when we had, during that year period, I think very few, if any, people even came forward. And I, from a personal perspective, might have a little trouble just saying in perpetuity, like, to your point, Jim, you know, in perpetuity, we're just gonna allow this, because then it's not amnesty anymore, it's changing what the law is, and so I think,
To be honest with you, this was an attorney's
I recall.
helping out 2 or 3 clients,
I
and
recall.
he was successful in doing it.
Yeah.
I won't leave it at that.
So then we probably should just delete it. I was just bringing it up that it's an opportunity maybe to increase. Just
Well, I think are you saying leave the general amnesty there, or just?
leaving the general amnesty there.
or-
But I'm not so sure that that's a good idea either. You're encouraging illegal
We'd have to
behavior.
have a debate on that, I
Yeah,
think.
we
Another
would.
problem is there's plenty of houses still out there that never took advantage of that amnesty. And
Yeah, so delete it.
I suppose you could actually provide another 1 or 2 year amnesty.
You could.
That would be another
Give
option.
them another window.
Give them another window.
It's a complicated issue because most people, I've been involved with some of them, they don't understand the ramifications of the building code. They just think, oh, we'll just put it in, and then they go and they realize, what do you mean? We gotta have 2-hour rated walls, we gotta have all these other things. It's almost impossible to do, but we should have a
I
separate.
think it's very misleading, you know, I think it gives people the belief that the zoning board is the only hurdle, when it's really not, there's 2 hurdles.
Right.
And the more challenging hurdle might be the building code with the nuts and bolts of what's required. And it is sometimes next to impossible to achieve what's necessary.
At a reasonable price.
Right.
So it's-
It more than likely would never be feasible for most people that have an illegal in-law apartment in their basement or something, you know, it's next to impossible, so.
So it seems like deletion would be the best option here.
There is no amnesty.
Right.
Yeah, I think so. I think we gave it for a year for a special purpose. And I think it's misleading myself. The people, think they can do it, and that they spend a lot, it's not really practical.
That's why I brought it up tonight,
Okay.
is to get the sense while we're all
You guys feel
here.
the same way?
And we have the accessory apartment
You know,
bylaw
now we
now
have the
too,
accessory.
so
I
it
think
wasn't in
that
place.
takes, right, I think
Yeah.
that,
Okay.
I think it should go away.
So delete.
So we'll add that to the table
Yeah.
proposal.
Delete.
Remember, all these have to go to town meeting.
Yes.
They make the ultimate decision. So we'll add it.
It's expired anyway, so, but you just delete it.
Actually, in this case, we could, since it's expired. We could just delete it without going back to town meeting, right?
No,
No, it's coming out
We
of the
have to.
bylaws.
it's not valid, but to take the actual
take it
language
away.
out of the bylaw,
Goes
it's
to
town
town meeting.
meeting's
Right.
choice.
Yeah,
All we-
okay.
yeah.
Okay.
It's like dinosaur bones, it's there, but it's not functional.
Okay.
I'm the color commentator.
I've noticed. Are there other thoughts or comments on the tables? We have one more section we'd really like to try to
Let's get into the one more section, because we can always come back. I
Run
want to keep
through.
moving.
Just at least quickly run through. But again, we're looking for comments on these tables and, you know, what's missing, what's questioned, you know. If you can answer some of the other policy or other questions we raise in the footnotes, to delete this or rewrite it, tell us to rewrite it, tell Brian to rewrite it, that would be great. So the more of these things we can check off, the more we can, you know, get a quicker, full bylaw. So, and again, feed comments to the color commentator here.
And I will forward them post-haste.
Okay, and so the last one is Article 10, the non-conforming section. This is the third major section that we were asked to look into. And I'm gonna turn it over to Bob. Who's
Well, we started with the proposition that we'll try to keep as much as we can of what you have, just pull it into a different organization. Some things we had to rewrite because the statutes have changed. But just doing a crosswalk between the old and the new, I had a check against omitting something that you had there. So it's basically a new document that carries a lot over that doesn't have any potential for inconsistency with state law. It's just what you like. The difficulty with this whole section, it's anchored in a section of the general law that nobody truly understands in depth. Chapter 48, Section 6 I see Attorney Beelen laughing here, because, you know, we both know that judges have referred to this as the most indecipherable language in the general laws. So, but the take-home point is that towns have the opportunity, when they create their provisions dealing with nonconformities, to be more generous than the state statute would have it be. It sets out a set of defaults that will operate in the absence of any language in your bylaw that is more generous than what the state law would otherwise require. So, we've put in language that, for example, if you take 37-4, enforcement, there are 3 sections of the general law that has just changed relatively recently, that talks about the old 6-year commencement of an action to remove a building that is in nonconformity. 10 years if it was not built in accordance with a building permit, and anything, the biggest change is if a building was built without having the benefit of a building permit and it lasts more than 10 years, the legislature has decided that it ought to enjoy the status of a prior non-conforming use, a legal prior non-conforming use, which is an extremely generous thing for the state to do. So we took what language that you had in your original bylaw dealing with this topic and replaced it with the language of the general laws, which is preemptive in this respect.
Excuse me, are you saying that, I thought you heard you say that we were more generous, but now we're gonna revert back to we were stricter and now we're gonna go to the state law, which is more generous?
In some respects, the state law is preemptive in effect, and this is one of those instances. And it provides that if property has been improved without the benefit of a building permit, and it has lasted for 6 years, in the past, before this relatively recent amendment of the statute, it couldn't be ordered down. But on the other hand, it would continue with much the same status as a variance would have. So if the owner of the property came in to seek an extension or expansion or a change, it would carry the burden of a variance, which is not a prior non-conforming use. Extensions, expansions, and changes are more easily obtained if it has legal prior non-conforming status. But if it's a variance, it doesn't enjoy that. The most you get with a variance is the right to avoid having it ordered down.
Yeah, that's okay.
But no longer is that the case. The legislature has said that it not only is insulated from an order of removal, but it also enjoys the status of a legal prior non-conforming use. And now the owner of such a property can seek an extension or expansion or amendment, with the ease of other uses that.
Our zoning doesn't say that, but state law does. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Because I don't pay attention to state law. I only do ours, and I didn't realize that change had happened.
Well, that's just one area in which we have embedded language that was intended to bring you into conformity with the state statute.
We really don't have a choice with that?
No.
Okay, then that's a good reason to do it. I just wanted to understand, because I see it all the time, and I wasn't unaware. So it's 6 years now instead of 10?
No, it's
Yeah.
10 years, but it's the fact, so they used to, after 10 years, as you just explained, after 10 years, they used to be non-conforming, not subject to enforcement.
Right.
But now they're deemed almost like a grandfathered, and you can come in for a special permit in our
They
circumstance.
become pre-existing non-conforming.
Yes, they're
They go
entitled
from
to the
illegal
same
structure-
protections.
Yeah.
Yes,
They convert to pre-existing non-conforming, and that timetable is what?
10 years.
So before, it would just stay an illegal structure, but you couldn't tear it down.
Perpetuity,
It would
right.
just stay there the way it is, and you couldn't touch it. But does, that-
Exactly.
what happens if they've been put on a violation notice, but it's never been enforced? How do you, what?
Well, there's certain requirements. So if there's a notice of appeal filed within that 10 years, then they are subject, they don't get that entitlement.
Okay.
So there's different things
I
that
better
come
do
into
some
play.
reading on
It's
this.
been
This
in
is new.
place, I think it was effective November 2nd, 2016, I think is the effective date.
I'm right on
That
top of
change.
things here.
Violation has to be recorded at the registry of deeds or land court
Yeah.
too.
Ooh, not just filed with the town.
No, no.
But that's still, you still can't create, you couldn't add anything to make it more non-conforming
Oh, you can never
regardless
do
of the
that,
time
yeah.
period.
Well, you shouldn't let it, these guys, you'd never let them make it non-conforming. You're generally asking to make it less conforming.
Keep our eye out for those
Yeah,
things, Jim.
that's your job, yeah, I know. I'm sorry, I was missing something there.
Well, once again, it's a question of taking your bylaw, keeping what we can, adding what we must, and putting it into some sort of organizational structure that makes it readable. So, it would be extremely unwise to, at 8:30 in the night, after having talked through what we've just talked to go into 48.6 in its depth. I would ask that you take a look at this and compare it as I did. You can take the document that you have, and then the document that exists in your bylaw now, and look for the provisions that are corresponding, and see what we've done to them. In some instances, we've simply cleaned up the language. In other instances, we've clustered things together that belong together. And in some instances, we've deleted language, and some places we've added it. So it would be a good exercise. And I would really value your reading this and getting back to us either directly or through Brian or Tom on if any questions that you may have about what you see and why it's there. But overall, my sense is that the town has made it somewhat easier for non-conforming uses and structures to do things than might be the case under a default provision of 48.6. 48.6 starts off with the language that says, except as otherwise provided, comma, everything that follows. Well, this is your opportunity to otherwise provide. So if you want to go up to a period of time beyond which you cannot go to say something, you can adopt shorter periods of time. And those are the options that I leave open to you. If you read something and think that you want to be more stringent, you can do that, unless there's some provision in 48.6 that has preemptive effect, and there are very few of those. This is the toughest area and I think I'm seeing a nod from Councilor Bilon over there. It is just very, very difficult text. Bob and I have put together a guidebook with a table that purports to dissect the language of 48.6. There's one sentence that's over 350 words with over 23 commas that you would find misplaced in many instances. It is virtually indecipherable, and we try to make sense of it, but at the same time, accepting the invitation of the legislature to act otherwise. And this is your opportunity to flex your muscles and be more stringent than the state law would have you be, as long as you step beyond certain forbidden boundaries, and I've tried to keep you within those. So if you think it's too loose and you'd like to tighten it up, you probably can. There are some instances in which benefits are accorded to those on a finding that may not be required, because if the property in question it increases the non-conforming nature of the structure, it may actually cause a variance to be required. But your bylaw in some instances says, no, we're gonna let you do it on a finding that it's not substantially more detrimental to the neighborhood, which is a lesser finding. But do you want that? You can certainly do it. But if you brought in the higher standard of increasing the non-conforming nature of the structure, so you need a variance, well, you could do that. But in some instances, your bylaw is more generous, and you may want to rethink that.
We would particularly be looking, from the zoning board, because this is obviously your bailiwick, ride, because, but the planning board certainly, if you see things or you know how this works or doesn't work, let us know, because this is really one of the key parts of a local zoning bylaw, as Bob said, because you have flexibility here, and it can be very complicated, and so how best can we write it for the town of Falmouth?
The Supreme Judicial Court has referred to this section of the general law as the most impenetrably dense text ever authored by the legislature. There are no two lawyers that will agree on what it says. Bob and I have tried to do that in a two-page chart, which we have in a book that we're about to release. But it's tough. It's tough.
I'm confused. Bob, you keep referring to 48.6.
Yes.
That's a state law, right? We're looking at our section
Oh,
non-conforming.
yes, that's a part of the general law.
Okay, so I'm, all right, because I,
48 is the
that's-
zoning act, the state
Okay.
zoning act.
Yeah,
but it's covered in ours in non-conforming structures, and
Right.
it's 37, but
Right.
it's referenced there, okay.
yeah,
But in the first.
it will be
Okay,
Article 10.
referring to it, okay.
Yeah, it'll be Article 10.
I never
of it.
read the laws, so
Not
general,
knowing what
so
this
that's why I
is,
don't know anything
on the
about it.
first paragraph,
Yeah.
it says, first publication of notice of the public hearing on this bylaw required by general law
40A,
Section 5.
Well, that's the
Different
provision
section.
dealing with the method of adoption.
It's different,
That's the
okay.
process for notification for the zoning board's meeting.
That's what I wondered.
Section 6
Is
is
the-
sort of the heart is the substantive part of
That's
nonconformity.
the impenetrable part.
That's the
Yeah.
impenetrable part. The easy part is the process, just putting out your notice and holding a public hearing.
Yeah,
I would not be fearful in reading this, to think about what you really want to do. And if you don't see that expressed here, discuss with us whether you think you'd like to do that, and we'll tell you whether it's consistent with the statute.
okay.
So be bullish in this if you think it doesn't say what you want. There are a few instances in which we'll tell you you can't do that. But in most instances, you probably can, because the section starts off, except as otherwise provided by bylaw, comma, here's what happens. So if your bylaw is silent, you're gonna be governed by chapter 48, section 6 of the zoning act. But if you're not silent, then you can deviate from those default provisions and be as stringent or as generous as you'd like to be.
And can you change this as time goes on, or once this is voted by town meeting, that's it?
Well, until the
Okay.
next town meeting.
You can always
Well,
go
that's
back to town
okay.
meeting.
The
Yeah,
next town meeting.
that's what I wanted to know.
Every 6 months.
Any other thoughts or comments about nonconformity at 8:30 at night?
We'll get back to you.
Yeah, I think
Ah,
I'd like
great.
to start
Right.
again on that another time.
Yeah.
The last thing I just wanted to point out is you did get another Article 4. This is simply your existing language, what your zoning districts are, how to go about, what the zoning map regulations are, formatted, cleaned up, put it in a list. Nothing substantive change, but you have that, so if you spot anything in error or you have any comments or questions, again, we're looking for that, but that's a simple.
When would we be getting an updated draft that's covered what we've been over this evening?
That's a good question.
Because I would rather work off that than try to,
some of this, I don't have a good answer.
let us
You know,
know.
I'm gonna have to digest this,
Think about it and get back
look
to
at my
us.
notes, because some of this is easier to just tweak with the next draft, and some of it's
Let us
probably,
know.
some of it, as you know, we're gonna have to have our own meetings and conversations.
We're going into town meeting, we're busy for a while, so.
So, you know, sometime, you know, and then next week, I'm actually gone all week, so I'm not around to be drafting, but I would say,
So jealous. I'm so jealous.
well, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, well, October actually has almost 5 weeks, so,
Thank you.
sometime in, you know, probably the mid-October, we'll be getting some redrafts and probably some additional drafts of the recodified sections that aren't substantively changing. So the third and fourth week, we would have more material for you.
So by November 1st.
Oh, yeah, by November 1st, yeah, we will definitely have more materials.
I have a question. Back at the beginning, early on, there was a list of 9 ambiguities that the zoning board had found. Have you checked on those? And
Is,
this was back on early on.
is that, do I have a copy of it? Can I just see that for a second?
Yeah, no, you can have it. I made you an extra copy. Take it.
Like, compare comparison, but I just see like big difference. It's almost verbatim.
Okay.
Yes, I had it.
It doesn't look familiar, so I'm not sure
Oh.
I have it. I know the other zoning board one that Tom read for, about the definition section, I actually was not on that email, so I didn't get that one either, so. I appreciate this, and I'll look at it, and,
I have one other question.
and
The accessory apartment allows for an 800 square foot apartment. So how come we?
A maximum of 800.
Right, well, yet we allow a maximum of 900 for a garage. I think we take more thoughts for the people than the cars.
No, the reason for that was we're concerned, there's a lot of small houses, and we promised people when we passed this bylaw that we wouldn't be creating duplexes, and we really wanted to, you know, we wanted to be smaller. We didn't want them to be bigger, but, I mean, that was the thought process. We weren't thinking about cars, we were thinking about neighborhood compatibility.
But cars are, you build a nice garage and
Yep.
come back later and say, oh, I'd like to change it into
But you can't use it all as an accessory apartment right now, you can only use 800 square feet.
Bob gave it to me.
Well, not if you submit a plan, and you have to get it built to code, unless you're breaking the law.
Move it back.
From Sam.
back
That
to
was a big battle, we.
Get back.
Okay, sorry.
No problem.
What else we have, gentlemen, is that it?
That's it.
Well, I think we wanted to put a plug in for the deleted section to say, let's take a look at the deleted section, the last section of your book. Sections that are recommended to be deleted. So telephone exchange, those things we talked about before, so we might put a plug in for taking a look at that and sending back to me your bits of wisdom about what you think should be deleted out of that last section.
Yeah, some of these are obvious to be deleted, like something that's already been expired, but some of them are related to some, you know, this was passed years ago, and other boards have taken over this responsibility. You know, I'm getting a whole history here from Brian,
So
so,
start with the small ministerial ones, and work your way to some of the bigger policy level questions that are probably not going to be answered between now and the next town meeting, but we should start thinking about them and maybe checking them off as time goes by. Think about that. Is this the right tool? Is this the right time? Are there other jurisdictions that have preemption or better tools for some of those things that we're proposing to delete? We'll start with the easy ones first, like ice, or telephone exchanges.
We still have a historic ice house in Highfield.
Yes, we do. That's right. Yes, we do. And some of the warehouses, you can still see, well, I'm sorry. Talked about it
Are
later.
we all ready? Because we need to go to bed.
I would just really thank all of you. This has been so productive and so helpful, and, you know, this is really what we're looking for, that, you know, because some of these questions, this is your bylaw, not our bylaw, so
I take that as a
thank you all.
motion to adjourn.
To adjourn?
You good?
Motion we adjourn.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This is.
Thank you.